Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own. A thick, woolen quiet that pressed against my eardrums. Then came the other sensation, the one that lives in the animal part of the brain, the part that hasn't forgotten the shape of eyes in the dark. It was a feeling of being watched, not by Flynn, who was long gone, but by something else, something that had been waiting in the bones of this old cabin for the quiet to settle, so it could begin its patient observation. My skin tightened, a slow, cold ripple across my arms and the nape of my neck. My breath, which had been coming in ragged little gasps, slowed without my permission. My body instinctively trying to be still, to be small, to hide from a gaze I could not see. The handcuff bit into my wrist, a cold, unforgiving circle of steel. Flynn had clicked it shut with a magician's flourish, his smile a white, perfect slash in the dim lantern light. "A new game, Bonnie," he'd whispered, his breath warm and smelling of the expensive whiskey we'd shared. "A test of wits. See if you can get free before I get back." He kissed my forehead, a benediction, and then he was gone. The door shutting with a soft, final thud, the lock turning with a sound like a bone breaking. That was hours ago, or maybe it was days. Time had begun to curdle in the stale air. The cabin was his idea, a rustic retreat to mend the fractures in our marriage. He called it unplugging. I called it a beautiful prison. The walls were rough-hewn logs, the chinking between them dark and crumbling like ancient scabs. A single kerosene lantern sat on the rough wooden table, its flame guttering and dancing, throwing long, leaping shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. The air was a cocktail of smells: pine resin, dust, the damp earthiness of the foundation, and beneath it all, a faint, coppery tang, like old pennies or dried blood. I pulled against the cuff again, a frantic animal jerk. The bed frame, an iron monstrosity bolted to the floorboards, groaned but held fast. The metal teeth gnawed at my skin, and a fresh bloom of warmth told me I'd opened the raw patch there. The pain was a bright, sharp counterpoint to the creeping dread. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, to think. Flynn's voice echoed in the hollows of my mind, smooth as polished stone. "You're so fragile lately, Bonnie. So skittish. This will be good for you. Build some character." He loved that word, character. It was the chisel he used to shape me. A floorboard creaked. The sound was not in my head. It came from the far corner of the room, near the stone fireplace blackened with decades of soot. My eyes snapped open. The shadows there were deep, a pool of absolute blackness that the lantern light could not penetrate. I held my breath, my entire body rigid. Nothing. Just the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. It was the house settling, I told myself. An old house, breathing its slow, timbered breaths. But then a new sound emerged, soft and insidious. A rhythmic, wet scraping, like a tongue licking a wound, like something dragging itself across the rough floorboards. It was coming from under the bed. My throat sealed shut. I strained against the cuff, pulling my body up, trying to peer over the edge of the mattress. I could see nothing but darkness and a few dust kittens trembling in the draft. The scraping stopped. The silence that rushed back in was 10 times worse. It was a listening silence. Memories began to surface then, unbidden, like corpses from a peat bog. Flynn, a month ago, his hand on the small of my back at a party, guiding me just a little too firmly. "Smile, Bonnie," he'd murmured, his lips never losing their genial curve. "People are watching." Another memory. Him standing over me as I cried, a bewildered look on his handsome face. "I don't understand why you're so unhappy. I give you everything." And he did. Everything but an escape route. The scraping started again, closer this time, right beneath me. I whimpered, a small, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I could feel a cold draft now, seeping up from the space under the bed, carrying a smell of damp clay and something else, something sweetly rotten, like forgotten meat. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the fireplace. It did not move like a man. It was a slithering, a flowing of blackness, a stain spreading across the floor. It had no definite shape, yet it suggested forms my mind recoiled from. The curve of a spine not meant to bend, the suggestion of too many limbs, or perhaps no limbs at all. It paused in the middle of the room, a pillar of living shade, and I felt its attention fix on me, a weight as physical as a hand on my throat. "Flynn," I croaked, the name a desperate prayer and a curse all at once. The shadow did not respond. It began to pulse, slowly, like a vast, black heart, and with each slow, rhythmic contraction, the room grew colder. My breath plumed in the air. Frost etched delicate fractal patterns across the lantern's glass chimney. The flame inside shrank, its light turning a sickly, bruised blue. This was no hallucination. This was the thing that lived in the silence Flynn had forced upon me. This was the rot at the center of our beautiful, broken life, given form. It was feeding on my fear, on my isolation, on the very essence of my helplessness. It was the truth he had locked me in here to face. The thing flowed forward again, soundless, until it was at the foot of the bed. The cold radiating from it was intense, a deep, bone-aching chill. I could see now that it wasn't empty blackness. Within its form, faintly, I could see things moving, shifting. I saw the pale, terrified oval of my own face reflected back at me 1,000 times. I saw Flynn's smile and lion mouth. I saw other faces, strangers, all trapped in that endless, swirling dark. It reached for me, not with a hand, but with a tendril of concentrated cold and dread. It touched my bare foot. A jolt of pure, undiluted horror shot through me. It was not pain, but something worse. A total, cellular understanding of my own insignificance. A preview of an eternity of nothingness. I screamed. A raw, tearing sound that ripped through the cabin's silence. I thrashed against the cuff, my wrist grinding, blood slick and hot against the metal. I would tear my own hand off to get away. I would. The thing recoiled slightly, as if my scream was a physical blow. The lantern flame sputtered and flared back to its normal, warm hue. The shadow retreated, melting back into the corner, its presence receding but not gone. It was waiting. It had all the time in the world. I was sobbing now, great, heaving sobs that racked my body. The terror had been replaced by a profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. I had nothing left. My mind, stripped bare, began to turn on itself. What if Flynn wasn't coming back? What if this was the game? Not a test of wits, but a final, elegant solution to the problem of me, the fragile wife, the skittish Bonnie. He could come back to a tragedy, a beautiful, tragic story. He'd be the grieving widower. He'd sell the story to a magazine. The thought was so monstrous, so perfectly Flynn, that it felt true. It felt more real than the iron bed frame, more real than the blood on my wrist. This was the revelation, colder than the shadow's touch. The monster outside was terrible, but the one I had married was so much worse. He had built this cage, and he had thrown me to the wolves of my own mind, and into the thing that fed on them. Hours bled into one another. I drifted in and out of a troubled sleep, my dreams a lurid tapestry of chasing shadows and Flynn's smiling face. I was awakened by the sound of an engine, tires crunching on gravel, voices. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through me. I tried to shout, but my throat was a raw, closed thing. I managed a weak, rasping cry. I heard footsteps on the porch. The door rattled. "Hello, anyone in there?" A man's voice, unfamiliar, laced with official concern. The lock splintered, and the door swung open. 2 state troopers stood there, their broad forms blocking the daylight. Behind them I saw Flynn, his face a masterpiece of contrived anguish. "Bonnie! Oh my God! Bonnie!" The troopers rushed in. One of them, a young man with kind eyes, saw the handcuff, saw the blood, saw the wild terror on my face. "It's okay, ma'am. You're safe now. We're here." He worked quickly, pulling a key from his belt and unlocking the cuff. The release was so sudden, so absolute, that my arm flopped down, numb and useless. Flynn rushed to my side, gathering me into his arms. I came back and the door was locked. I couldn't get in, I thought. I thought something had happened to you. He smelled of fresh air and faint cologne. His embrace was a cage. I could feel the eyes of the troopers on us, their pity a tangible thing. They saw a relieved husband and his traumatized wife. I tried to speak, to tell them. The words were a tangle in my mouth. The shadow. It was here. He left me. The older trooper nodded sympathetically. "She's in shock, sir. Exposure dehydration. She's hallucinating." Flynn looked down at me, his eyes full of a tender, possessive concern. "It's the game, officer. A stupid game. I never should have left her. She has such a vivid imagination. Sometimes she gets confused about what's real." "Wah!" He smoothed my hair back from my forehead, his touch making my skin crawl. He was rewriting the story right in front of them, and they were believing every word. As they helped me to my feet, my legs buckling under me, I looked back into the cabin. The lantern had been extinguished. The room was dark, but in the far corner, for just a second, I saw it. The darkness shifted. It pulsed. Once, a slow, patient rhythm. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting. It knew, as I knew, that this was not over. They led me out into the blinding sun, into a world that now felt thin and unreal. Flynn held me close, his arm a steel band around my shoulders, his voice a soothing murmur in my ear, telling the troopers, telling me, telling everyone the story of what had happened here. His story. We drove away from the cabin, down the winding mountain road. I sat in the passenger seat, silent, watching the trees blur past. Flynn reached over and took my injured hand, his thumb stroking the raw, circled flesh on my wrist. "It's going to be okay, Bonnie," he said, his voice soft and hypnotic. "We're going to get you the help you need. Everything is going to be perfect now." I didn't look at him. I looked out the window, at the deep, dark spaces between the trees, and I felt the first thing again, the oldest thing, the one that lives in the animal part of the brain. It was a feeling of being watched. My skin tightened, a slow, cold ripple across my arms and the nape of my neck. My breath, which had just begun to steady, slowed without my permission. He was still talking, his words a smooth, practiced river flowing around me, but I was no longer listening. I was listening to the silence inside the car. It was different from the cabin's silence. This was a thin, brittle quiet. stretched taut over the hum of the engine and the whisper of the tires on asphalt. And underneath it, so faint it was almost a vibration, I could still hear the echo of that wet, rhythmic scraping. His thumb continued to move over my wounded wrist, a mockery of a caress. Each stroke was a claim, a brand. He thought he had won. He thought the game was over, that he had proven his point about my fragility, my need for him. He had no idea that the game had changed. The rules were different now. I had seen the truth, not just about him, but about the world we lived in. It was a place where such things could exist, where shadows could hunger, and where a man could lock his wife away to be devoured by the quiet. We reached the main highway, the car accelerating into the stream of anonymous traffic. The normalcy of it all was a jarring, dissonant chord. People in other cars were sipping coffee, talking on phones, completely unaware of the abyss that had just opened up in my life. An abyss my husband was now calmly steering us away from. "I called Dr. Evans," Flynn said, his tone light and conversational, as if discussing the weather. "He can see you this afternoon. He's very good with episodes like this." I said nothing. I kept my face turned to the window, my body limp and pliant in his grasp. It was the only defense I had left, this feigned catatonia. To fight him now, to scream and rant about shadows and monsters, would only cement his narrative. It would be the final proof of my brokenness, and he would use it to lock me away in a different, more clinical kind of cage. A hospital, a sanitarium, somewhere with soft walls and smiling, dismissive doctors. So I let him think he had broken me. I let the silence between us grow, a silence I now recognized as my ally. It was in the silence that I had met the other thing, and it was in the silence that I would find my way back to it. Not as a victim this time, but as something else. He took me home. Our house, a beautiful, airy structure of glass and steel, stood gleaming in the afternoon sun. It had always felt like a showroom, a stage set for our perfect life. Now, it felt like a tomb. He led me inside, his hand firm on my elbow. The air was stale, the silence here different again. It was a dead silence, a vacuum. "I'm going to draw you a bath," he said, his voice dripping with a solicitousness that made my stomach turn. "You'll feel better after you've cleaned up and rested." I nodded, a slow, vacant motion, and let him guide me to the bathroom. He ran the water, tested the temperature, laid out a fluffy white towel. He was performing the role of the caring husband perfectly. As the tub filled, he stood and looked at me, his head tilted. "You know I only did it because I love you, Bonnie. I had to make you see. I had to make you strong." The words were so grotesque, so perfectly inverted, that I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. I choked it down, turning it into a weak cough. I just stared at the steaming water. He left me alone then, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I didn't move. I listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall. I waited. Then, I turned off the tap. The sudden quiet was immense. I looked at my reflection in the vast, mirrored wall. My face was pale, my eyes hollowed out and dark. The raw purple bracelet around my wrist stood out in livid contrast to my skin. But it wasn't just my reflection I saw. For a moment, just a flicker in the periphery, the glass seemed to deepen, to show not the room behind me, but a darkness that pulsed with a slow, familiar rhythm. The coppery, rotten smell from the cabin ghosted through the steam-filled air. A small, cold smile touched my lips. It was not a smile of happiness, but of recognition, of understanding. He thought he had introduced me to a monster to teach me a lesson. He didn't realize that he had simply introduced two monsters to each other. And I was no longer the skittish, fragile Bonnie he thought he could control. The thing in the silence had shown me what I was made of. It had shown me my own darkness, and I was no longer afraid of it. I was learning to use it. The game was not over. It had just begun. And this time, I would be the one who made the rules. He did not lock me in the bathroom. That would have been too obvious, too crude for a man like Flynn. He trusted in the more subtle locks he had installed in my mind, the ones that whispered I was helpless, that I needed him, that the world outside our beautiful, terrible life was too frightening to face alone. He trusted the performance of normalcy. I did not take a bath. I stood for a long time, watching the steam condense on the mirror, obscuring my reflection and the things that moved just behind it. Then I methodically cleaned the wound on my wrist, wrapping it in a bandage I found in the cabinet. The act was deliberate, a reclamation of my own body. When I was done, I opened the bathroom door and walked out into the hall. Flynn was in the kitchen making tea. The domestic scene was so jarringly normal, it felt like a scene from a play. He looked up, his expression a careful blend of relief and concern. "Feeling better, darling?" "I'm tired," I said, my voice a flat, quiet thing. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. I was tired of his games. I was tired of being the canvas upon which he painted his masterpiece of a life. "Of course you are," he said, coming toward me with a cup. "It's been an ordeal. Drink this. It will help you sleep." I took the cup. The porcelain was warm, delicate. I did not drink. I held it, feeling the heat seep into my hands. I looked past him, out the large kitchen window to the manicured garden beyond. The sunlight was bright, but the shadows under the hydrangeas were deep and velvety. "I think I'll lie down," I said. He nodded, his smile gentle, victorious. "A good idea. I'll be in my study if you need me." I walked to our bedroom, the one with the vaulted ceiling and the pristine white rug. I lay down on the bed, still in my clothes from the cabin, and closed my eyes. I did not sleep. I listened. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tap of Flynn's keyboard from his study, the faint rush of traffic from the highway. And underneath it all, I listened for the silence. I invited it in. As dusk began to bleed to the sky, turning it a bruised purple, I felt the change. The house grew stiller. The sounds from Flynn's study stopped. The air grew thick and cold, just like in the cabin. I opened my eyes. The corner of the room, the one farthest from the door, was already dark. But this darkness was not an absence of light. It was a presence. It thickened, coalescing, and began to pulse. The sweet, rotten smell filled my nostrils. Flynn's footsteps sounded in the hall. He was coming to check on me. The doorknob turned. The shadow in the corner flowed forward, a tide of blackness that swallowed the light from the window. It did not move toward me. It moved toward the door. Flynn stepped into the room. "Bonnie, are you awake? I was thinking we could order." He stopped. He saw it. His face, so often a mask of calm control, went slack with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The thing of shadow and cold enveloped him. It did not attack him, not in any physical way I could see. It simply wrapped itself around him, and he froze, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on some horror only he could see. I sat up in bed, swinging my legs over the side. I watched, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in my chest. I felt no fear, only a cold, clear certainty. Flynn made a sound then, a thin, high whimper. It was the sound of a soul being scoured. He was learning a new lesson now. He was learning what it felt like to be small, to be helpless, to be utterly and completely seen by something that fed on fear. I stood and walked toward him. I stopped a few feet away, outside the circle of intense cold that radiated from the shadow. Our eyes met. In his, I saw the death of every lie he had ever told, every manipulation he had ever crafted. He saw in my eyes that I was not a victim. I was a witness. I was the architect of this moment. The shadow tightened its embrace. Flynn's knees buckled. He did not fall so much as he folded into the darkness, which then began to recede, flowing back into the corner and vanishing, taking him with it. The room was silent. The air began to warm. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, ordinary shadows across the floor. I walked to the window and looked out at the night. The world was the same, yet entirely different. I was alone. I was free. And in the deep, quiet places of the world, I knew I had a new and terrible ally. The game was over. I had won, and the silence that remained was finally blessedly my own. The silence was a physical thing, a presence in the house that was neither malevolent nor kind. It was simply complete. For a long time, I stood at the window, watching the headlights of passing cars paint brief, fleeting streaks across the walls. No one knew. No one would ever know. Flynn was gone, erased from the world as neatly as he had tried to erase me. A practical thought surfaced, cold and clear. His study. I went there first. The desk was tidy, his laptop closed. I opened it. He had not logged out. He never did. He believed his control was absolute. I navigated to his email, to the drafts folder where he often composed messages he never sent. A digital diary of his manipulations. There it was, a message addressed to no one, time-stamped from the morning he left me at the cabin. She is breaking beautifully. The isolation is the key. When I return, she will be pliable. She will finally understand that her world begins and ends with me. The next phase can begin. The trust fund is nearly mine. I deleted the draft. I then began the methodical process of deleting his user profile from the computer, wiping the hard drive with a utility he himself had installed to protect his precious work. I was erasing him, byte by byte. Next, his phone. I found it in his jacket, slung over the back of his chair. I scrolled through his contacts, his messages. There was nothing of consequence, just more lies woven for colleagues and acquaintances. I powered it down, removed the SIM card, and placed the phone in the pocket of my own dirty jeans. Later, I would dispose of it somewhere far from here. The house felt different as I moved through it. The spaces he had dominated now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. I went to the closet and gathered his clothes, his prized suits and cashmere sweaters, and stuffed them into black garbage bags. I did this not with anger, but with a detached efficiency. It was necessary cleanup. As I worked, a faint, coppery scent would sometimes whisper past, and the air would chill for a moment before returning to normal. It was not a threat. It was an acknowledgement. We were bound now, the thing and I, by a shared secret and a shared feast. When the dawn began to lighten the sky, I loaded the bags into the trunk of his car. I drove to a donation bin in a strip mall parking lot 20 miles away and shoved them all inside. On the way back, I stopped on a bridge over a deep, fast-moving river and dropped his phone into the dark water. The SIM card I crushed under my heel and scattered to the wind. I returned to the house as the sun was fully rising. I took a long, hot shower, scrubbing the last remnants of the cabin from my skin. I dressed in my own clothes, comfortable and familiar. Then I made a phone call. Dr. Evans's office, a bright voice answered. "Hello," I said, my voice steady, infused with a convincing tremor of grief. "This is Bonnie Thorne. I'm so sorry to call so early, but I need to cancel my husband's appointment for today. And mine as well." I let a pause hang in the air. A calculated silence. "There's been a terrible accident. Flynn, he's gone." The voice on the other end was immediately flooded with sympathy. They offered condolences, asked if there was anything they could do. I declined gracefully, saying I needed to be with family. It was a perfect performance. He would have been proud. The police came, of course. A different set of officers from our local precinct. I told them the story of a marital argument, of him storming out in the middle of the night, distraught after our traumatic ordeal at the cabin. I said I'd assumed he'd gone to a hotel to cool off, but when he didn't return my calls by morning, I knew something was wrong. I wept, but not too much. I was the concerned, confused wife, fragile from one tragedy, and now facing another. They took a report, a missing person. They asked if he was suicidal. I said I didn't know, that he had been under so much stress. They promised to look into it. I knew they would find nothing. Men like Flynn don't leave traces unless they want to. In the weeks that followed, I played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. I accepted casseroles and condolences. I spoke to reporters with a quiet dignity that painted a picture of a perfect marriage cut short by a mysterious tragedy. I was the sympathetic figure, the woman who had survived a kidnapping only to lose her husband. The trust fund, as he had written, became mine. Tonight, I sit in the quiet living room. The house is truly mine now. The silence is my companion. Sometimes, in the deep of the night, I feel a familiar chill and catch a faint, rotten scent on the air. I am not afraid. I look toward the darkest corner of the room and I nod. It is a partnership of necessity, a bond forged in the crucible of his cruelty. He created the monster in the shadows, and he created the monster in me. In the end, we were the only two things that were real. The silence is mine, and I am never, ever alone. The first anniversary of his disappearance passed with little fanfare. A few friends called, their voices hushed with a sympathy that had grown thin and practiced. I thanked them, my own voice a model of weary grace, and hung up the phone feeling nothing but a vast, cool emptiness. The investigation had stalled months ago. They'd found his car parked at a trailhead 50 miles north of the city, his wallet in a passenger seat. The narrative wrote itself. A man, overcome with guilt or grief, walks into the wilderness and never walks out. It was clean. It was acceptable. It was a lie that fit neatly into the world. I found I preferred the nights. The dark held no terrors for me anymore. It was a familiar cloak. I would sit in the living room with all of the lights off, watching the moon trace its path across the floor. I was waiting, not with fear, but with a quiet anticipation. The thing from the cabin had become a part of my life, a secret tenant in the spaces between the walls. Its visits were not frequent, but they were regular. A drop in temperature, a shift in the quality of the silence, and then that scent, like old blood and damp earth. It never showed itself fully again, not like it had the night it took Flynn. It was more a feeling of a presence, a shared watchfulness in the dark. One evening, I was in the garden. The hydrangeas were in full, bloomy bloom, their color a ghostly blue in the twilight. The air was warm, thick with the scent of jasmine, and then it wasn't. A cold spot moved through the garden, a pocket of winter that made the flowers tremble. The scent of jasmine was choked out by that other, older smell. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the darkening sky. A sound began, soft at first, then clearer. It was the sound of scraping. Not the frantic, terrified scraping of my own nails against wood, but a slower, more deliberate sound, like a gardener tending to soil or an artist smoothing clay. I looked down. At the base of the largest hydrangea bush, the dark, rich soil was being disturbed. It churned and folded as if worked by an invisible trowel, and from within it, something pale began to emerge. It was not a bone. It was smoother, smaller, a stone. As it was pushed fully to the surface, I saw it was a river stone, worn smooth by water, and it was a perfect matching pair to the one I had dropped into the river months before with Flynn's SIM card. It was a message. A gift. I knelt, the damp grass soaking through the knees of my trousers. The cold was intense around my kneeling form. I reached out and picked up the stone. It was ice cold to the touch. I held it in my palm, this little piece of smooth, hard evidence that the world was not as it seemed, that the rules I had once lived by were meaningless. I understood then that our partnership was not over. It was evolving. I had thought it was a single transaction, my freedom for his life. But this thing, this presence, was not a tool to be used and discarded. It was a companion. It was showing me that it could provide, that it could communicate. It was asking for something in return, though I did not yet know what. I closed my fingers around the stone. "Thank you," I whispered to the chilling air. The cold began to recede, and the scent of jasmine slowly returned. The scraping sound had stopped. The soil at the base of the hydrangea was perfectly smooth again, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. I stood, the cold stone a heavy weight in my hand. I walked back to the house, to my beautiful, silent house. I placed the stone on the mantelpiece, a solitary, unremarkable artifact. It was a reminder. The game was not over. It had simply changed shape. He was gone, but the silence he had forced me to embrace had become my greatest strength. And in that silence, a new and terrible understanding was growing. I was not just a survivor. I was a keeper, and my work had only just begun. The stone became my talisman. It sat on the mantel, a dull gray eye that saw everything and gave nothing away. Life settled into a new, quiet rhythm. I managed the trust fund with a cold competence that would have impressed Flynn. I donated to charities, not out of kindness, but to maintain the facade of the philanthropic widow. I was a ghost in my own life, and it suited me. The presence continued its visits, each one a little longer, a little more substantial. The cold would settle in a room for an entire evening, the scent of decay becoming a familiar, almost comforting perfume. I began to speak to it, not aloud, but in my mind. I would tell it about my day, the petty frustrations of dealing with lawyers and bankers. I felt a flicker of acknowledgement in return, a subtle shift in the pressure of the air. It was listening. One rainy Tuesday, I was in the study, going over financial statements. A deep, penetrating chill filled the room, and the reading lamp on the desk flickered. I looked up from the papers. The shadow in the corner was denser than usual, a pool of ink that seemed to drink the light. For the first time since it took Flynn, a thread of sound emerged from it. Not a scrape or a whimper, but a low, resonant hum, like a cello string vibrating deep underground. It was a wordless question, and I understood it. It was asking about the man at the bank, Mr. Henderson, who had been subtly questioning the speed with which I was consolidating assets. He was a potential problem. He's suspicious, I thought, the words forming clearly in my mind. He's a careful man. He doesn't believe the stories. The hum deepened, resonating through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. An image, sharp and unbidden, flashed behind my eyes. Mr. Henderson, walking to his car in a deserted parking garage, the sound of his own footsteps echoing. Then, a shadow detaching itself from behind a concrete pillar. The image vanished. The chill in the room receded, and the hum faded into silence. I sat very still, my heart thumping a single, powerful beat. It not just listened. It had shown me. It had offered. 2 days later, the news reported that a prominent bank manager, Arthur Henderson, had taken an unexpected leave of absence due to a sudden and severe nervous breakdown. He was found in his garage, muttering about things in the shadows, his suit coat soaked through with a smell of stagnant water and damp earth. I felt no triumph, only a cold sense of rightness. The problem was solved. That evening, I went into the garden and stood by the hydrangea bush. The air grew cold. I didn't speak. I simply held the gratitude in my mind, a simple, clean emotion. The soil at the base of the bush churned once, softly, and then was still. A new understanding passed between us, a silent pact sealed. It would keep my world orderly, and I would be its anchor. I would be the quiet, respectable face it showed the world, the still water that hid the terrifying depth beneath. We were not just companions. We were collaborators. And our work, I knew, was far from over. The next problem was a woman named Sarah Price, a freelance journalist who had written a speculative piece about high-profile disappearances following traumatic events. She had circled back to my story, sensing, with the unnerving instinct of her kind, that the official narrative was too neat. She had left 2 messages, her voice polite but persistent, a dog with a bone. I sat in the study, the stone cool against my palm. I didn't need to summon the cold. It came as I thought of her, of the potential disruption she represented. The air grew heavy, and the familiar scent bloomed, this time with a new, acrid note, like ozone after a lightning strike. I formed the thought, clear and sharp. Sarah Price. She will not stop digging. This time there was no hum, no single image. Instead, a flood of sensation poured into my mind. The feeling of typewriter keys under my own fingers, the smell of old coffee and cheap perfume, the frantic, buzzing energy of a mind chasing a story. Then, a crushing pressure, the sensation of being physically squeezed by the very air, of a story becoming too big, too real, too close. The mental scream of a mind that could not shut itself off, that was being forced to see the terrifying truth lurking behind every shadow, in every silent moment. I gasped, dropping the stone onto the desk. It landed with a solid thud. The presence lingered, waiting. It was not just offering a solution. It was asking me to define the punishment, to be an active participant in the design. I picked up the stone again, my hand steady. I focused on the journalist, on her prying eyes. I did not wish for her death. I wished for her silence, a permanent internal silence. I fed the thought into the chilling air around me. Let the story she chases be the only thing she can see. Let it consume her. The cold vanished so abruptly it left a vacuum in the room. The scent faded. I knew it was done. A week later, a small article appeared in the back pages of the paper. Journalist Sarah Price had been committed to a private psychiatric facility. The article quoted a colleague saying she had become obsessed with her work, suffering from severe paranoia and hallucinations, convinced that a shadow story was following her. She was, by all accounts, catatonic, lost in a world of her own terrors. I cut out the article and placed it in the fireplace. I watched the flames curl the paper black, reducing her ambition to ash. There was no guilt. There was only the quiet, chilling satisfaction of a maintained equilibrium. The world was a noisy, chaotic place, and I had been given the means to impose a perfect, terrible order. My ally and I were in harmony. The silence we created was our masterpiece. Story 2. The sound was a dry, rhythmic click in the deep velvet of the night. A sound like a beetle's carapace tapping against a window pane, over and over. It was the only thing alive in the silence of Ashley's small bedroom, a tiny, insistent metronome counting down the seconds until dawn. She lay perfectly still, listening to it, her body a tense wire beneath the quilt. It wasn't the clock. She had pulled its plug an hour ago, the little digital numbers fading with a soft sigh. This was different. This was closer. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall, or perhaps from inside her own head. A fossilized heartbeat finally unearthed. She had first noticed the spirals 3 weeks ago, scratched into the damp wood of the dock behind the Sea Hag Tavern. They were crude things, like a child's drawing of a whirlpool, but something about the precision of the groove, the way it seemed to have been worn, not carved, made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She mentioned it to Josiah as they walked home, the salt wind whipping her hair across her face. He'd shrugged, his large, warm hand squeezing hers. "Kids with pocket knives and too much time," he'd said, his voice a low, comfortable rumble that usually soothed her. Or old man Henderson drunk again, trying to summon a mermaid. But it wasn't just the dock. The next day, she saw it again, a perfect, tiny spiral etched into the condensation on the window of the general store. Then, another, a larger one, drawn in the sand below the cliff path, so symmetrical it looked machined. She started seeing them everywhere, a secret code written over the town of Haven's End. In the froth of her cappuccino, the whorl of her own fingerprint suddenly seemed menacing, a map to some terrible inward center. Josiah stopped calling it a prank when the fish came in. The local fleet, a handful of weathered trawlers, returned one Tuesday morning with their holds full of abomination. The catch was all twisted, the cod and haddock and flounder grotesquely deformed, their bodies coiled upon themselves in slick, scaly spirals, their bones fused into impossible corkscrews. Their eyes were milky orbs, and from their gaping mouths, tiny, perfect seashells spiraled inward. The stench on the pier was biblical, a thick miasma of rot and salt and something else, something metallic and ancient. The fishermen, grim-faced men who had weathered nor'easters and rogue waves, stood pale and silent, refusing to touch the catch. They dumped the writhing, spiraling mass back into the sea, offering to a god that had already rejected it. The town changed after that. The change was subtle at first, a quiet corrosion. People began to walk with a slight, unconscious list, as if the very ground beneath them was tilting towards some unseen drain. Conversations faltered, sentences left to spiral into nothing. Ashley worked at the town's small library, and she saw it in the returned books, where patrons had absent-mindedly drawn spirals in the margins, over and over. The ink sometimes pressed so hard it tore the paper. The air itself grew heavy, humid in a way that felt intentional, a warm, wet cloth pressed over the mouth and nose. Josiah, who fixed anything with a motor and a prayer, found himself with less and less work. People were forgetting how to fix things, or perhaps they no longer cared. He spent his days now boarding up the windows of his small garage, not against a storm, but against the creeping unease. He watched Ashley, saw the fragile light in her eyes dimming, the way her hands would sometimes tremble as she sorted books. He tried to hold her at night, but she was stiff, listening to that faint, clicking sound he could never quite hear. "It's in the trees, Josiah," she whispered one evening, her face lit by the flickering blue of the silent television. Outside, the wind had picked up, but it didn't howl, it hummed, a low, resonant note that made the fillings in his teeth ache. He looked out the window. The ancient pines that ringed the town were twisting, their trunks groaning as they bent into unnatural curves, their branches knitting together in vast arboreal whirlpools. It was slow, geological, but it was undeniable. The whole world was curling in on itself. The authorities came, of course. Men from the state in clean sedans and concerned expressions. They took water samples, soil samples, air samples. They interviewed people with gentle, condescending voices. They left after 2 days, their reports filed away in some forgotten cabinet. There was no toxin, no pathogen, no logical explanation. One of them, a younger epidemiologist with tired eyes, pulled Josiah aside before he drove away. "It's in their heads," he'd said, tapping his own temple. "Mass hysteria. It'll pass." But as he got into his car, Josiah saw the man's notepad sitting on the passenger seat. The top page was covered, edge to edge, in a single, densely packed, hypnotic spiral. The clicking in Ashley's room grew louder. It was no longer just at night. It followed her through her days, a phantom percussion to the town's slow-motioned arrangement. She saw Mrs. Davison from the flower shop walking down the center of Main Street, her head craned at a severe, permanent angle, her neck a spiral of strained tendon and bone, her mouth a perfect O of surprise. No one tried to help her. They just stepped around her, their own movements becoming increasingly circular, their paths through town no longer direct but meandering, looping back on themselves. Then came the rain. It fell not in drops, but in fine, swirling tendrils, a mist that moved against the wind, coiling through the air like sentient smoke. Where it touched the skin, it left a faint, sticky residue that smelled of the deep ocean and something older, the scent of stone and stars. People began to retreat into their homes, but the homes offered no sanctuary. The wallpaper began to peel at the corners, the patterns of roses and stripes blurring and reforming into swirling vortices. The wood grain on the floor seemed to writhe, the knots opening like dark, hungry eyes. Josiah found Ashley in the library basement, surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten periodicals. She was on her hands and knees, not crying, not screaming, but meticulously arranging a pile of dust and dead silverfish into a perfect 3-foot-wide spiral on the concrete floor. Her fingers were raw. Her eyes were wide and vacant, reflecting the single bare bulb overhead. "Ashley," he said, his voice cracking. He knelt beside her, tried to take her hands. They were cold as clay. "It's the only shape," she whispered, her voice the rustle of dry leaves. "It's the shape of everything, of seashells and galaxies and the path down your own throat. It's the shape of time itself, Josiah. It doesn't move forward. It just curls. We were wrong of everything." He carried her home, her body light and limp in his arms. The town was silent now, save for that omnipresent hum and the soft, squelching sound of the earth underfoot. The asphalt of the streets was softening, the yellow lines warping into gentle S-curves. The fences were collapsing into elegant, rusted springs. He saw a dog, or what had once been a dog, its body a twisted knot of fur and bone, crawling in a slow, perpetual circle in the middle of an intersection. He barricaded them inside his house, nailing planks over the doors and windows, but he knew it was a futile, linear thought in a world that had rejected straight lines. The spiral was not an invasion. It was a revelation. It was the universe remembering its true face. The hum was inside him now, a vibration in his marrow. He could feel the bones in his hand wanting to follow the curve, to twist into a more elegant, more eternal form. He found Ashley in the bathtub, the water cold. She was staring at the drain. Her hair, long and dark, was floating around her head like a halo, and as he watched, it began to slowly, deliberately, coil upon itself, each strand twisting into a tiny, perfect ringlet. She turned her head to look at him, and her neck did not turn. It rotated, a smooth, seamless revolution. Her smile was a soft, curving line. "Don't you hear it?" she asked. "The great unwinding. It's so beautiful." The clicking sound was deafening now. It was the house, the world, the very fabric of reality ticking over into its final, true configuration. Josiah backed away, stumbling into the living room. The planks he had nailed over the windows were splintering, not from a force outside, but from the wood itself changing, the grain spiraling outward, pushing the nails free with soft, popping sounds. Through the gaps, he could see the sky. It was no longer blue, but a swirling, bruised palette of violet and green, a vast, celestial fingerprint. He sank to his knees. The fight went out of him, not in a rush, but in a long, slow exhalation, a spiral of breath. He looked at his own hands, splayed on the floorboards. The skin on his knuckles was beginning to pucker, to fold in on itself in a pattern of concentric circles. It didn't hurt. It felt like coming home. The hum filled him, a lullaby of infinite descent. He was a knot being untied, a story being rewound to its first and only word. Ashley stood in the doorway, her form no longer entirely solid, her edges blurring into the warping air. She was becoming a beautiful complex equation, a theorem of curve and light. She held out a hand that was more suggestion than substance, a gesture that was itself a spiral. And somewhere, in the heart of the silence that was not a silence but a frequency too deep for hearing, in the center of the town that was no longer a town but a mandala of sublime ruin, a voice, or the memory of a voice, perhaps Josiah's, perhaps Ashley's, perhaps the voice of the spiral itself, began to whisper the last words. The whisper was not a sound, but a pressure, a gentle insistence in the mind. And the words were not words at all, but a feeling, a knowing that this was how it had always been meant to be. The walls of the house were breathing now, a slow, pulsing rhythm that matched the clicking, the hum, the spiral of Ashley's hair, and the corkscrew of the dog's spine in the street. Josiah felt the last of his resistance unravel, a single frayed thread pulled from a tapestry. He reached for Ashley's offered hand, and as their fingers met, his own began to soften and stretch, the bones within flowing like warm wax, curling around hers in an inseparable double helix. His vision blurred, not with tears, but with a new way of seeing. He no longer saw objects, but paths, currents of energy, all flowing in the same beautiful, inevitable curve. The roof above him peeled back like the skin of an orange, not to show the sky, but to reveal that the sky and the house and the town and his own mind were all one continuous surface, a single vast and living spiral, turning, always turning, into the quiet, welcoming dark at the center of everything. And the click was the sound of the lock, and the hum was the sound of the door opening, and the spiral was the path, and the path was home. The pressure in his ears became a constant, a low thrum that was the world's new heartbeat. He tried to remember the word for straight, for flat, for right angle, but the concepts slid away like water off oilskin. They were lies, temporary illusions in a universe that had always been curved. His own memories were reshaping themselves, not as a timeline, but as a coiled thread, his childhood touching his present, his future already written in the first loop. He watched his own legs as they folded beneath him, not in a collapse, but in a graceful, deliberate spiral. He sat on the floor, which was no longer a plane, but a gentle, concave bowl. The furniture was melting, not into liquid, but into formlessness, its essence returning to the primal swirl. The sofa was a soft fabric whirlpool. The books on the shelf were shedding their rectangular identities, the paper and ink flowing into a single pulsing manuscript of concentric circles. Ashley, or the being that had been Ashley, drifted towards him. She was a column of softly shifting light, a human-shaped vortex. Where her feet should have touched the floor, the boards flowed upward to meet her, a continuous exchange of substance. She knelt before him, and her touch was like cool water flowing over stone. There was no more Ashley, no more Josiah, only the recognition of similar patterns in the great design. The walls dissolved into a fine, shimmering mist, revealing the world outside. Heaven's end was gone. In its place was a breathtaking, terrifying landscape of pure geometry. The hills were rolling sine waves. The river was a glittering Mobius strip, its surface and underside one. The people, the animals, the very trees, had all resolved into their final, perfect forms, their bodies elegant sculptures of winding lines, their movements a slow, perpetual dance along the curves of existence. There was no suffering, no fear, only the profound peace of absolute symmetry. He felt a great loosening within his chest, a final release. His heart uncoiled from its frantic, linear rhythm and settled into a slow, spiraling pulse that beat in time with the hum of the world. His thoughts, his fears, his love for Ashley, all of it unwound, not into nothingness, but into a simpler, purer pattern. He was not dying. He was simplifying. He was becoming an idea, a note in the endless song of the spiral. His last sight was not with eyes, for he had no eyes left, but with a pervasive, all-encompassing awareness. He saw the entirety of the spiral, not as a vast thing, but as a single point, infinitely dense with potential, and he was part of it. The click and the hum merged into a single, silent tone of acceptance. The journey was over. He had reached the center, and the center was everywhere. The silence that followed was not an absence, but a completion. The tone of acceptance was the only law, a physical constant as real as gravity had once been. What had been Josiah was now a pattern of gentle ridges on the floor, a fossil record of a life that had ended in a different geometry. The being of light that had been Ashley settled over him, not a covering, but a merging, their two patterns aligning into a single, more complex harmony. The world continued its slow, deliberate spin. The spirals that had been houses and trees and people began to drift, not through space, for space had lost its meaning, but through the substance of the new reality. They were currents in a vast, slow-moving ocean of form. The great unwinding was over, and the great stillness had begun. It was a stillness of perfect balance, where to move was to be still, and to be still was to move along the eternal curve. Time was a spiral that had finally closed upon itself. There was no past to yearn for, no future to dread. There was only the endless peaceful now, a single moment stretched and curved into infinity. The center held, and in holding it was everything. The whisper of the last thought faded into the hum, which was not a sound, but the fabric of being. There was no one left to hear it, and so it was finally, perfectly, heard by all. The light that was Ashley and the ridges that were Josiah began a final, slow descent. The floor itself was softening, yielding like the skin of a great fruit, and they sank into it without a ripple. The boundaries of the house, already a memory, dissolved completely. There was no inside or outside, only the continuous, curving landscape. Above, the sky spiral turned with a majestic, silent grace. The colors bled and flowed, not as light, but as thought, as emotion. A swirl of violet was the memory of the sea's chill. A streak of green was the ghost of pine needles from the old straight trees. It was all preserved here, not as history, but as pigment in a living painting. The other forms, the ones that had been the people and creatures of Haven's End, drifted in a slow, stately dance. Their paths were not random. They traced the invisible lines of the great design, their movements a form of mathematics made flesh. The twisted dog shape moved in a tight, joyful orbit around the flowing column that had once been Mrs. Davison, a perfect system of two bodies bound by an unseen force. There was no pain in its twisted limbs, only the pure expression of its new function. A quiet understanding passed between all the patterns, a communication that needed no words. They were a completed thought. The anxiety, the fear, the desperate struggle to maintain a straight line in a curved universe. It was all gone, a forgotten dream. This was the truth that had been waiting underneath the world of edges and corners. This was the peace that came from knowing there was no end, only the endless, beautiful return. The hum deepened, becoming a tangible presence, a medium in which they all floated. It was the sound of the universe at rest, the vibration of a string that had been plucked once at the beginning of time and was now, finally, settling into its fundamental, eternal note. The spiral was not a thing to be seen, but a state of being to be felt. It was the shape of silence. It was the form of grace. And it was, forever, enough. The slow dance of forms continued for an eternity that lasted no time at all. The light in the ridges that were Ashley and Josiah settled into a stable, interlocking pattern on the ground, a testament written in a language of contour and flow. The world was a single, cohesive entity, a finished tapestry where every thread followed the same, inevitable curve. Then, a new sensation began. Not a sound, but a shift in pressure. It started at the farthest edges of perception, a gentle tug, a soft and insistent pull. The great spiral, in its perfect stillness, was beginning to turn. It was not a rotation in space, but a turning inward, a drawing in of all that was toward the silent, dark point at the center that was also the circumference. The forms began to move again, not in their individual dances, but as one. They flowed like iron filings drawn to a magnet, their paths converging. The landscape itself was in motion, the sinusoidal hills folding in on themselves, the Mobius Strip River pouring itself into the gathering stream. It was a gentle, inexorable contraction. The being of light that remembered Ashley felt no fear, only a quiet sense of culmination. The journey along the curve was ending, not in a destination, but in a source. The hum, the constant tone of the world, began to rise in pitch, not to a scream, but to a clear, pure chime that resonated through the very essence of reality. The pattern swirled faster now, a galaxy condensing. The colors of the sky bled together into a single, blinding white. The ridges and the light and the twisted, beautiful shapes of all that had been Heaven's End drew closer, their edges merging, their individualities dissolving into a collective whole. They were not being destroyed. They were being gathered. The chime became a single, sustained note that was also a point of infinite density and infinite peace. There was a final, soft click, the sound of a universe settling into its true and final shape. The pull ceased. The movement stopped. There was only the center, a perfect, silent, and eternal spiral, small enough to hold in the palm of a hand, vast enough to contain all of time and space, resting in the quiet dark, waiting to begin again. The waiting was not passive. It was a state of profound potential, a coil of energy held in perfect tension. Within the silent, dark center, the spiral dreamed. It dreamed of straight lines and sharp corners, of chaos and noise and the frantic, beautiful struggle of things trying to be separate. It dreamed of a town called Heaven's End, of a man named Josiah and a woman named Ashley, of a hum that was a warning and a click that was an invitation. And then, with a soft inward sigh that was the opposite of a breath, the spiral began to unwind. It was not an explosion, but an unfurling, a gentle exhalation of form and substance. The single point expanded, its perfect curves relaxing, flowing outward. The blinding white softened, differentiating into the faint, bruised colors of a twilight sky. The hum returned, but it was distant now, a memory on the edge of hearing. Shapes emerged from the flux. Straight lines, tentative and new, etched themselves across the expanding reality. A horizon, flat and unwavering, cut across the field of vision. A square of light appeared, a window. Behind it, a ceiling, flat and white. Josiah drew a breath. It was a ragged, linear thing, a straight arrow shot through his lungs. He was lying on a hard, flat surface. The air smelled of dust and old paper. He pushed himself up, his joints protesting in their familiar, angular way. He was in the library basement. Towering shelves of forgotten periodicals surrounded him, their edges sharp and defined. Across from him, Ashley stirred. She was sitting on the floor, her back against a shelf, her knees drawn up to her chin. She looked pale and tired, but her eyes were clear, focused. They were not vacant. They were full of a terrible recent knowledge. The clicking was gone. The world was silent, save for the rustle of her movement and the sound of his own breathing. He crawled to her, the rough concrete scraping his palms. "Ashley?" She looked at him, and for a moment, her gaze was ancient, seeing the spiral that still underlay the fragile straight lines of the world. Then she blinked, and she was just a woman in a basement. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It let us go." Josiah followed her gaze to the floor between them. There, sketched in the thin layer of dust, was a single perfect spiral. It was already beginning to fade, disturbed by their movement, by the straight, clumsy passage of their bodies through a world that was, for now, mercifully flat. But for a moment, it was there, a signature, a reminder of the shape that waited beneath it all, patient and still and forever. He reached out a trembling hand and smeared the dust, obliterating the spiral. The act felt both sacrilegious and necessary. Ashley flinched as the pattern was erased, a small, sharp intake of breath that was the only protest she offered. The flat, gray concrete was a relief, a blankness he craved. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice unfamiliar in the absolute quiet. It was just a voice again, not a vibration. He stood up, his legs feeling weak and strangely long, his bones once more content to be straight, rigid pillars. He offered her his hand. Ashley looked at his outstretched palm for a long time, as if assessing its architecture, the way the lines on his skin intersected. Finally, she took it. Her grip was cold, but human. He pulled her to her feet, and they stood together in the dim, silent basement, surrounded by the rectilinear order of the shelves. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step a jarring impact of right angles. The library above was untouched. Sunlight, ordinary and golden, streamed through the tall rectangular windows, illuminating dust motes, dancing in straight, following lines. The books sat neatly on their shelves, their spines forming a mosaic of perpendicular titles. The world had been restored, but it felt like a stage set, a flimsy fabrication. The front doors of the library were unlocked. They stepped out into the morning. Heaven's End looked exactly as it had yesterday, and the day before. The streets were clean. The stoplights cycled through their colors. A car drove past, its engine a mundane roar. A man walking a dog nodded to them from across the street. The dog, a terrier, trotted in a perfectly straight line. "It's all still here," Josiah breathed, the words a prayer of disbelief. Ashley didn't answer. She was staring at the telephone wires overhead. They sagged in a gentle, natural curve between the poles. Her eyes tracked the arc, her head tilting just slightly. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from her. A resonance felt more in the teeth than in the ears. Josiah followed her gaze, his own mind instinctively trying to force the curve into a series of straight segments. He failed. The curve was just a curve. It was just a wire. He had to believe that. "Let's go home," he said, more to himself than to her. They walked without speaking. Everywhere he looked, he saw the ghost of the spiral, in the whirlpool pattern of a fallen maple seed, in the concentric circles of a manhole cover, in the way a woman's curled hair bounced on her shoulders as she walked. Each one was a tiny hook in his mind, a tug toward the memory of that infinite welcoming descent. When they reached his house, it stood intact. The planks were gone from the windows. The door was unbarred. It was just a house. He fumbled for his keys. the metal jangling a harsh, discordant sound. Inside, everything was in its place. The sofa was a sofa. The books were books. He went to the bathroom and turned on the tap, splashing cold water on his face. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were tired, but they were his own. The skin on his knuckles was smooth. When he came out, Ashley was standing in the middle of the living room, perfectly still. She was looking at the floor, at a particular spot near the center of the room. "It happened here, didn't it?" she said softly. "Where you finally stopped fighting." He nodded, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. She looked up at him, and her expression was one of profound and unsettling peace. "It's not gone, Josiah. It just paused. It's waiting for us to remember." She held up her hand, and as he watched, the lines on her palm seemed to shift, to deepen, ever so slightly, into the beginning of a familiar swirling pattern. It's so much easier when you stop trying to be straight. He wanted to argue, to shout, to shake her until the strange light left her eyes. But the memory of that peace was a seductive poison in his veins. The struggle to hold a line, to build a life on the lie of flatness, felt suddenly unbearably heavy. His gaze fell upon the wooden floorboards. He had never noticed it before. The subtle, almost invisible grain. It wasn't straight. Each plank was a record of a tree's life, a slow, cellular spiral toward the sun. The pattern was there, written into the very foundation of his home. He had been walking on it his entire life. A low thrum started up again, not in the air, but inside his skull. It was the same frequency as the hum, but this time, it felt familiar. It felt like his own. He looked at his hands, at the skin stretched over bone. He saw the delicate whorls of his fingerprints, the tiny, unique spirals that identified him. They weren't just on his fingertips. They were in the way his hair grew from his scalp, in the cochlea of his inner ear, in the very structure of his DNA. He had been fighting himself. A soft, surrendering breath escaped him. The tension that had held his spine rigid for years, the constant low-grade anxiety of maintaining a straight path in a world of curves, simply dissolved. His shoulders rounded. His posture softened into a more natural, gentle arc. Ashley smiled. It was not her old smile. It was a slower, more knowing expression. A curve of infinite patience. She held out her hand, not in a gesture of pulling him, but of invitation. The thrum in his head grew louder, harmonizing with the memory of the world's hum. The straight lines of the room began to waver, not as a terrifying dissolution, but as a shedding of a cumbersome disguise. The edges of the windows bled softly into the walls. The ceiling bowed into a gentle dome. He didn't take her hand. Instead, he knelt, placing his own palm flat on the floor. The wood was warm, alive. He could feel the vibration moving through it, a slow, deep pulse. He closed his eyes and stopped trying to see a flat surface. He let himself feel the great, gentle curve of the earth beneath him, the spin of the planet, the arc of its journey around the sun. When he opened his eyes, the room was different. The walls had melted away into the shimmering mist, and the spiral landscape of Heaven's End stretched out before him, more beautiful and right than he had remembered. The being of light that was Ashley stood beside him, her form already merging with the ambient glow. He looked down at his own body. It was softening, its angles yielding to elegant, winding lines. The fear was gone. This was not an end. It was a correction. It was coming home. Together they stepped forward, not walking, but flowing into the great, slow dance of the world. The hum was a welcome, and the spiral was the only truth. And this time, he would not forget. The dance was slower now, more deliberate. The forms that were Josiah and Ashley did not lose themselves entirely in the collective glow. Instead, They moved as a distinct pair, two streams of consciousness braiding together through the luminous currents. Their path traced a wider, more complex spiral, a dance of two bodies around a shared center that was both themselves and the silent heart of the world. They passed the twisted, joyful form of the dog, which pulsed with a warm, amber light as they drifted by. They moved through the flowing column that was Mrs. Davison, and for a moment, Josiah felt a wave of her old, fussy kindness, now transformed into a constant, nurturing warmth that radiated outward. There were no words, only these exchanges of pure essence, a language of being that was more direct and honest than speech had ever been. The world was not static in its perfection. It was a living tapestry, and the patterns were in a state of constant, gentle rearrangement. A hillock of soft green light would slowly resolve into the memory of a forest, only to dissolve moments later into a river of silver thought. It was a conversation the universe was having with itself, and they were both the speakers and the words. The peace was not an emptiness. It was a profound fullness. Every moment of their former lives, every fear and every joy, was not erased, but integrated, like a single, unique thread woven into the grand design. The struggle had given the surrender its meaning. The straight lines had made the curves feel like grace. Time was not a line they had escaped, but a dimension they now inhabited fully. They could feel the entirety of their story at once. The first click of the radio, the terror of the changing world, the final acceptance in the library basement. It was all present, not as a memory to be recalled, but as a permanent part of their pattern, a contour in their eternal form. The hum was the music of this existence, and their movement was the lyric. They drifted for an age, or for a single heartbeat, along the endless, beautiful curve. There was no need to go anywhere, for they were already everywhere they could ever need to be. The center was not a place to reach, but the fact of their connection to all of it. And it was, and they were, and it was enough. The subtle pressure began again, not as a tug from the center, but as a gentle nudge from the periphery. It was a soft, inquisitive pulse, a new thought entering the shared consciousness of the spiral. The patterns of Josiah and Ashley slowed their dance, their light turning toward this nascent disturbance. It was not a threat. It was a question. From the shimmering mist of the unformed edges, a new line attempted to draw itself. It was stark and rigid, a jagged scratch of pure intention against the flowing canvas. It was the shape of a memory, the memory of a door and a name. Daniel... ... The thought was a sharp, angular thing, belonging to the being that had been Mrs. Davison. It was the memory of her son, who had moved away years ago to a city of straight lines and right angles. The spiral did not reject this sharpness. It welcomed it, absorbing the line, studying its form. The collective consciousness focused on this memory of odorness, of a world that still fought the curve. The hum shifted its tone, incorporating the dissonance, making it a part of the harmony. A shared understanding bloomed. Their peace was not the only state of being. The spiral was not a cage, but a choice. And a choice, to be true, must include the option to refuse. The light that was Ashley turned to the light that was Josiah. A complex idea passed between them, woven from the threads of their shared experience. It was the idea of a message, not a warning, for there was nothing to warn against, but an invitation, left where a straight mind might find it. As one, they turned their focus outward, toward the world of lines and corners that still spun on, oblivious. They pooled their intention not to escape, but to reach. The spiral facilitated their will, its curves acting as a lens, focusing their combined consciousness into a single, delicate point of influence. In a small, cluttered apartment in a city 1,000 miles away, Daniel Davison jolted awake. The digital clock by his bed glowed 3:17 a.m. The dream faded instantly, leaving only a profound sense of vertigo and a strange, lingering hum in his ears. He sat up, rubbing his face. The room was a collection of boxes and half-unpacked things, all sharp corners and flat surfaces. He swung his legs out of bed, his feet hitting the cool, flat, laminate floor. He needed a glass of water. As he walked toward the kitchen, his toe stubbed against a heavy, flat object leaning against a box. It was an old painting his mother had given him. Something she'd found at a flea market. He'd never liked it, never even unpacked it. He bent down, his sleep-addled mind curious. He pulled it out and leaned it against the wall in the dim light filtering in from the street. It was a simple, almost amateurish piece. A landscape of a quiet little town under a twilight sky. But as he looked at it, his breath caught. The brushstrokes that made up the hills, the trees, the clouds, they weren't random. Each one was a tiny, perfect spiral. The entire scene was a hidden, swirling mosaic. And there, in the center of the painting, standing on a path that was really a coiled line, were two faint, glowing figures. He leaned closer, his heart pounding a strange, syncopated rhythm. He couldn't make out their faces, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that one of them was his mother. The hum in his ears grew louder, harmonizing with the silent, swirling patterns on the canvas. He reached out a single, trembling finger, not to touch the painting, but to trace the empty air just above its surface, his hand unconsciously following the endless, beautiful curve. Story 3. She is brushing her hair. That is the first thing, and the last thing, and the only thing that seems real for a very long time. My sister Deanna, sitting at the vanity our grandmother left her, dragging the silver-backed brush through her long, wheat-colored hair, down from the crown of her head to the tips that dust the small of her back. A slow, metronomic sweep to her. Then again, and again. I am Kyle, and I am standing in her doorway. And I have been standing here for what feels like an hour, watching the rise and fall of her arm, listening to the whisper of bristles against hair, a sound like a constant, gentle fire. It is a Tuesday. It is always a Tuesday. I must have made a sound, a shift in the floorboard, a caught breath, because the brush stops midway through a stroke. Her arm is frozen, a pale parenthesis in the dim room. In the mirror, her eyes find mine. They are not her eyes. Not the light-filled blue of our mothers, but something older, something tarnished and reflective, like the surface of a well that has not seen the sun in 100 years. She does not blink. I do not blink. The house around us is holding its breath. The hum of the refrigerator, a distant mechanical heartbeat. Then, as if a switch has been thrown, she smiles. It is a small, precise movement of her lips, a gesture that contains no warmth, no recognition, only a kind of cold, anatomical curiosity. The brush resumes its journey. Down, sweep, lift. Down, sweep, lift. I back away, the hairs on my arms standing at attention, my own breath a trapped bird in my chest. It began with small absences. Deanna would be setting the table, and her hand would hover over a fork, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the kitchen wall, a point that seemed to recede into a distance we could not fathom. Mom, Garrison, would say her name, once, twice, a third time with a sharp edge of fear, and Deanna would startle back into herself, blinking, the fork clattering onto the plate. "Sorry," she'd murmur, "I was just," and the sentence would hang there, unfinished, a bridge to nowhere. Dad Julian would joke about teenage daydreams, but his laughter was a thin veneer over something solid and worried. We ate our meals in the glow of the television, the news a stream of other people's tragedies that felt safer than the quiet one brewing in our own home. Then the words started. Not her words. They would slip from her, usually in that suspended state between waking and sleep, when Mom or I would be checking on her. They were not English, nor any language I could place. They were guttural, percussive sounds, syllables that felt like stones being turned over in a dry riverbed. Once, I heard her speaking in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. A sound that seemed to come not from her throat, but from the spaces between the walls. I caught only a fragment, a phrase that has since etched itself onto the back of my eyelids. The angles will drink the light. I told no one. Some secrets are too sharp to handle. The doctors found nothing. No epilepsy, no tumors, no chemical imbalances they could name. She was a perfectly healthy 16-year-old girl, they said. Perhaps it was stress. Perhaps it was a creative outlet. They suggested a journal. Mom bought her a beautiful leather-bound one. Deanna used it to draw intricate, spiraling patterns that made your eyes water if you looked at them too long. Geometries that seemed to shift and writhe if you glimpsed them from the corner of your vision. It was Mom, in her desperation, who called the church. Not our bland suburban parish, but a number she found online, for a ministry that specialized in what they called spiritual disturbances. That is how Father Alistair came to our home. He was a young man, but he carried an old weight in his shoulders. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they missed nothing. He sat with Deanna in the living room while the rest of us pretended not to listen from the kitchen. He did not pray over her. He simply talked, his voice a low, calm river. And she, in her new flat voice, talked back. I could not hear the words, only the cadence, a terrible, rational discussion. When he emerged, his face was pale, the skin around his eyes tight. He looked at my parents, and then, strangely, his gaze found me, a small boy trying to be invisible in the doorway. There is a presence, he said. It is not a ghost. It is something that has always been here, sleeping in the clay beneath the house. It is not possessing her. It is conversing with her, and she is listening. Somehow, a producer from a cable network called Spectral Evidence got wind of it. A woman named Cassandra, all sharp angles and a smile that never reached her eyes, appeared on our doorstep with a contract and a crew of 3. She promised to help, to document a real modern-day case, to bring experts to find the truth. My parents, frayed and hollowed out by fear and helplessness, signed. They were so tired. The money, a sum that seemed astronomical to me, was a bandage on a gaping wound. So the cameras came. They were small, black, unblinking eyes mounted in the corners of our rooms. Microphones picked up the sigh of the furnace, the scuttle of a branch against the roof, the terrible silent weight of our dread. Our house, once a sanctuary, became a soundstage. Deanna seemed to become more lucid in their presence, or perhaps it was the thing inside her that became more performative. She would sit for hours in a circle of salt Father Alistair had laid, speaking to the empty air, her head cocked as if listening to a voice only she could hear. The crew, a bearded sound man named Leo and a perpetually bored camerawoman named Anya, treated it all with a detached professionalism that was more frightening than any superstition. They were just here for the footage. One night, I woke to the sound of Deanna's voice. It was not the alien language, but English, clear and cold as ice water. I crept from my room and saw her, standing at the top of the stairs, facing the wall. The camera in the hall corridor was a red cyclops eye. She was speaking to it. "They think they are building a story, Kyle," she said. And I froze, my blood turning to slush. They think they are building a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But this story has no end. It is a loop, a Mobius strip of consequence. They are not documenting it. They are feeding it. Their attention is the key that turns the lock. She turned her head, and those tarnished well eyes pinned me in the dark. The thing wearing my sister's skin smiled its cold, anatomical smile. "Father Alistair says it wants a door," it whispered. "But it already has one. It is the space between what is seen and what is believed." The next day, everything changed. Deanna collapsed during a filming session. Not a faint, but a violent, shuddering descent to the living room floor. Her body arced, her spine bending backwards at an impossible angle, a sound like tearing canvas ripping from her. Father Alistair was there in an instant, his crucifix held before him, his voice rising in a Latin prayer that seemed to physically press against the air. The crew was a whirl of activity, Cassandra barking orders, the camera lens focusing, drinking it all in. And my parents were just two figures, small and broken, clinging to each other in the corner. Deanna's head snapped up, her mouth opened, and the voice that was a chorus of flies, of static, of breaking glass, erupted. And in the silence between stars, I taste the dust of dead worlds. The angles are sharp and they cut. Let me show you. Every light bulb in the house exploded in a shower of glass. The cameras died. The digital recorders went silent. In the sudden, profound dark, there was only the sound of that voice and the smell of ozone and hot metal. And then, a new light. It came from Deanna. A faint phosphorescent glow emanated from her skin, from her open mouth, from her eyes. And in that glow, we saw them. The angles. They were not shapes, not really, but fractures in reality itself. Sharp, non-Euclidean lines of deeper darkness that sliced through the room. They did not move through the air. They moved the air. They moved space around them. They were drinking the light from the room, from our eyes, from our very souls. I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, a void that promised not oblivion, but an eternal silent awareness of it. Father Alistair did not flinch. He stepped forward, his prayer now a shout, a raw, desperate plea to a God he hoped was listening. He thrust the crucifix towards the thing that was his daughter. Deanna's hand, moving with a speed that was not human, lashed out. There was no contact, but the priest was thrown backwards as if by an invisible force. He hit the wall with a sickening crunch and slid to the floor, motionless. The thing turned its gaze on the rest of us. On Leo, who was fumbling with a dead microphone. On Anya, who was staring for the first time with genuine terror. On Cassandra, whose face was a mask of not fear, but of a terrifying, rapturous greed. It settled on my parents. Mom let out a small, broken sound, and then it looked at me. In that moment, the world fell away. There was no room, no family, no horror. There was only the void behind its eyes, and it was not empty. It was full of a knowledge so vast and so terrible that to comprehend even a fraction of it would unmake a mind. It showed me the loop, not just of this moment, but of all moments. Our lives, our history, our universe, all just a single repeating phrase in a chant that had no beginning and would have no end. Deanna was just a vessel, a temporary focal point for a truth that was too immense to be born. The possession was not an invasion. It was a revelation. And the revelation was that we are all possessed, all of us, by the tiny, fragile stories we tell ourselves to keep from seeing the endless, screaming static of the real. The light from Deanna faded. The angles withdrew, leaving only the mundane darkness of a power outage. She slumped to the floor, a doll with its strings cut. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows. Leo was sobbing. Anya was vomiting in a corner. Cassandra was already on her phone, her voice trembling not with fear, but with excitement, saying, "You won't believe the footage. We have to get it recovered. My God, we have it." My parents rushed to Deanna, gathering her unconscious form into their arms. They did not look at the priest's body. They did not look at me. Father Alistair was dead. A cerebral hemorrhage, the coroner would later say. A pre-existing condition, tragically triggered by stress. The recovered footage was, of course, a disappointment. It showed a girl having a seizure, a power surge, and a lot of shaky, dark confusion. There was no chorus of flies, no phosphorescent glow, no angles drinking the light. Cassandra's show aired, a sensationalized hour of speculation and fake reenactments. We were paid. We were abandoned. Deanna woke up the next day. She was herself again. The wheat-colored hair, the light-filled blue eyes, the soft voice. She remembered nothing. She was confused by the cameras, by the grief, by the way I flinched when she tried to hug me. The thing was gone. Or it was sleeping again. Or it had said what it came to say. We never speak of it. We are a family again. We eat dinner. We watch television. We are a portrait of normalcy, painted over a crack in the world. But sometimes I catch Deanna looking at nothing, her head cocked, as if listening to a faint, familiar tune. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up and I hear it too. Not a voice, not a sound, but the shape of a silence. A silence with sharp edges. And I know the ritual is not over. It has only just begun. The angles are waiting. The story has no end. The loop is eternal. The angles are waiting. The story has no end. The loop is eternal. The angles are waiting. I am in the basement, looking for a spare fuse. The air is thick and cool, smelling of damp concrete and laundry detergent. The single bare bulb overhead casts a waxy yellow light that pushes back the shadows, but does not dispel them. This is my chore now. After the storm last night, tripped a breaker. A normal task for a normal boy in a normal house. The mantra does nothing to calm the frantic bird in my chest. My hand closes around a cardboard box of fuses on a shelf behind the water heater. As I pull it down, my elbow knocks against a loose stone in the foundation wall. It shifts with a gritty scrape. I freeze, the box of fuses forgotten in my hand. I should not look. I should take the fuses and go upstairs, back to the kitchen light, back to my mother's nervous smile, and my father's hollow eyes. But my body is no longer my own to command. It moves with a will that feels both alien and deeply, terrifyingly familiar. I set the box down. My fingers, cold and clumsy, find the edges of the stone. It is heavier than it looks, but it slides out with another low grind. Behind it is a darkness that is not merely an absence of light, but a substance, a cavity. I reach into my pocket for my phone, my thumb trembling as I activate the flashlight. The beam cuts into the hole. There is no dust, no cobwebs. The space within is smooth, as if worn down by centuries of slow water. And there, resting in the center of the small, dark chamber, is my sister's journal, the beautiful leather-bound one Mom gave her. I never knew she had hidden it. I thought she had stopped drawing those impossible geometries. I lift it out. The leather is cold, and it seems to pulse with a slow, deep rhythm against my palm. I do not want to open it. I want to throw it into the furnace and watch it burn. But I am already opening it. The pages are not filled with spirals. Not anymore. The first half of the book is a chaotic mess of those shifting, nauseating patterns. But the pages after the night Father Alistair died are different. They are blueprints. They are schematics of our house, but not as it is. The lines are too sharp, the angles all wrong. Rooms are drawn inside of other rooms. Hallways twist back on themselves in ways that should be impossible. And there are symbols, sharp and angular, etched with a frantic, precise hand in the margins. They are the same symbols I saw in the air when the light was being drunk from the world. Beneath the most complex diagram, the one that shows the house folding in on itself like a piece of origami, She has written a single sentence in her familiar looping script. The door is not a place. It is a pattern. A floorboard creaks directly above my head. In the kitchen, a slow, deliberate footstep. Then, another. It is Deanna. I know her tread, but the rhythm is off. It is the slow, metronomic pace of the hair brushing. Down, sweep, lift. Down, sweep, lift. I shove the journal back into the wall, push the stone into place, and grab the box of fuses. My heart is a hammer against my ribs. I take the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the kitchen, breathless. My parents are at the table, drinking coffee. Deanna is standing by the sink, pouring a glass of water. She turns and smiles at me. It is her smile. Warm, light-filled, real. You were down there a while, she says. Find everything okay? I nod, unable to speak. I hold up the box of fuses like a trophy. My father takes them from me with a grunt of thanks. Everything is fine. Everything is normal. But as I stand there, the smell of ozone and hot metal is a ghost in my nostrils. I look at my sister, at the innocent slope of her shoulders, and I understand the most terrible truth of all. The thing is not gone. It never left. It simply finished its conversation with her. And now, she is building what it asked for. She is not a vessel anymore. She is an architect, and I am the only one who knows. The only one who saw the blueprint. The only one who can hear the silence beginning to sharpen in the corners of the room, waiting for the pattern to be complete. The days fold into one another, a careful origami of normalcy. I go to school, I do my homework, I take out the trash. I am a model of quiet compliance. But my eyes are no longer my own. They have become calibrated instruments, measuring the geometry of our home. I see the way the afternoon light falls across the hallway floorboards, and notice that the shadows it casts are a fraction of a degree sharper than they were yesterday. I watch Deanna as she moves through her own life. My sister who is, and is not my sister. She hums pop songs and argues with Mom about clothes and seems, to all the world, healed. But I see the other things. The way she will pause in the middle of the living room, her head tilting as if listening for a specific frequency. The way her fingers will sometimes trace invisible lines on the tablecloth. Her movements precise, deliberate, like a surgeon mapping an incision. She is not daydreaming. She is drafting. She is implementing the plan from the journal, using our home as her canvas, and the air itself as her medium. I try to find the journal again. One Tuesday afternoon when the house is empty, I go back to the basement. I move the water heater, my muscles straining. I find the stone, but the cavity behind it is empty. There is only a fine black dust that smells of static and cold stone. She has moved it, or it has served its purpose and dissolved back into the nothing from which it came. My fear is a cold, hard stone in my own gut. I consider telling my parents. I picture myself standing in the kitchen, the words bubbling out of me. Deanna is building a door for a thing that lives in the clay. She's changing the shape of the house. I see their faces, the weary disbelief, the concern for my mental state, the fragile peace shattering all over again. They could not handle it. They have chosen blindness, and it is the only comfort they have left. To tear that away would be a cruelty worse than the truth. So I watch. I become a silent witness to the slow, meticulous warping of our reality. A door that once stuck now closes with a perfect, whisper-soft click. A window in the attic, long painted shut, now opens onto a view of the backyard that seems a little too clear. The colors a little too vivid. Small things, insignificant things, unless you know what to look for. Tonight, a week after I found the journal, I am lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house is quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator, the distant mechanical heartbeat. Then, another sound threads its way into the silence. A soft, rhythmic scraping. It is coming from Deanna's room. I slip out of bed and press my ear to the wall we share. The sound is unmistakable. It is the sound of her hairbrush. Down, sweep, lift. Down, sweep, lift. But there is a new quality to it tonight. A finality. A sense of a last, perfect stroke being applied to a finished work. The sound stops. A new silence descends. One that is different from the quiet of a sleeping house. The silence is a held breath, a poised needle. It is the silence I heard in the wake of the angles, a silence with sharp edges. It gathers itself in the corners of my room, pooling in the darkness under my bed. It feels focused, directed. It is waiting for a command. From the other side of the wall, I hear Deanna's voice. It is not the chorus of flies, nor her own soft tone. It's a third voice, one I have never heard before. It is calm, resonant, and utterly devoid of anything human. It speaks a single word, a name or a coordinate that has no translation. The air in my room changes. It becomes thick, heavy, like water. The door to my bedroom, which I closed, is now open. The hallway beyond is not dark. It is filled with a faint, gray, directionless light. I can see the pattern in the wood of the hallway floor has shifted. The boards no longer run parallel to the walls. They now spiral inward, towards a point at the end of the hall, where Deanna's door stands ajar. I know I am meant to walk that path. I know the ritual requires a witness, the one who saw the blueprint, to see it completed. My body moves from the bed, my feet bare and cold on the floor. I do not want to go, but I'm caught in the pattern now. A cog in the machine she has built. I step into the hallway. The dimensions are wrong. The ceiling feels both too high and too low. The walls seem to breathe. I walk towards her door, the spiral of the floorboards pulling me forward. With every step, the hum of the refrigerator fades, replaced by a high, thin harmonic, a sound like a wire being stretched to its breaking point. I reach her door. I push it open. Deanna is standing in the center of her room. Her back is to me. Her room is no longer her room. The pink walls are gone, replaced by a vast, starless expanse of deepest black. The only light comes from the lines. Glowing, sharp, non-Euclidean geometries are etched into the floor, the walls, the very air. A perfect, three-dimensional rendering of the final diagram from her journal. It is the pattern. Iden. It is the door. She turns. Her eyes are not wells anymore. They are windows. And through them, I do not see a void. I see an endless, shifting city of impossible angles and silent, moving lights. She smiles, and this time it is not cold, nor warm. It is an expression of completion. It is done, she says, and her voice is the third voice, the voice of the architect. The door is open. She reaches out a hand, not to me, but to the pattern. The lines flare with a cold, hungry light, and from the open window of her eyes, from the heart of that impossible city, something begins to step through. It was not a form that entered our world. It was a conclusion, a final, absolute statement written in bone and shadow and the absence of sound. It did not step so much as it resolved into being, the pattern of the door tightening around it like a fist. The high harmonic in the air became a shriek that was not a sound, but a tear in the fabric of everything I knew. Deanna did not move. She was the conduit, the anchor point. Her body was rigid, her outstretched hand trembling with the strain of holding the door open. The conclusion turned its attention upon me. There were no eyes, but I felt its focus, a pressure that flattened my thoughts and stole the breath from my lungs. It was not malevolent. That would have been a comfort. Malevolence is a human emotion. This was simpler and infinitely worse. It was a process, a function, and we were terms in its equation. It spoke, not with a voice, but by rearranging the silence into a shape I could understand. The words formed directly in my mind, cold and sharp as shards of ice. The witness is present. The observation is necessary for the collapse of the waveform. The local reality is now defined. I understood then, with a clarity that was itself a kind of madness. This was not a possession. It was a correction. Our world, our lives, our linear time. It was all a loose thread, an anomaly. This thing was here to tidy it up, to fold our messy emotional existence back into the silent geometric truth of the larger reality. It moved towards me. It did not walk. The space between us simply became smaller. The patterned lines on the floor glowed brighter where it passed, as if drinking in its presence. I could not move. I could not scream. I was pinned in place by the sheer weight of its logic. From the hallway behind me, I heard a gasp. My mother. No. She was standing there, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that had finally, irrevocably, broken through her denial. She had come to check on the noise. She saw her daughter, transfigured into a living sigil. She saw the thing that was now turning its attention to her. The conclusion assessed her. A new variable, an unexpected term. The maternal unit, Dayal Bendim. Its emotional resonance is a persistent irregularity. Deanna, still locked in her trance, let out a low moan. A crackle of energy, like static electricity, danced along her arm. The thing shifted its form, a subtle reconfiguration of angles, and my mother made a small, choked sound. She didn't collapse. She simply folded. Her body slumped, not in death, but in a profound and sudden emptiness. The light behind her eyes went out, not with a flicker, but as if it had never been there at all. She stood, vacant, a shell. It had not killed her. It had solved her. It had resolved the chaotic, loving, grieving variable of my mother into a state of zero. The thing turned back to me. I could feel its focus intensifying, the pattern in the room burning brighter. I was the final witness, the last irregularity. I knew what was coming. It would not kill me. It would unmake me, smooth me out into the silent, endless static. It would make me a part of the eternal loop, a fixed point in the repeating chant. But as it reached for me, not with a hand, but with a concept, a final, chilling thought entered my mind. A thought that felt both like my own and like a whisper from the thing itself. The witness must be integrated. The story must be made whole. And I knew then that my fate was worse than my mother's. I would not be erased. I would be made to understand. I would be made to see the beauty in the angles, the truth in the silence, the perfection of the endless screaming loop. I would be made to love the thing that was consuming us. The pattern flared, white and absolute. The world became a single sharp line, and I felt my own self, my memories, my fears, my love for my sister, begin to unravel, not into nothingness, but into a vast, cold, and perfect equation. The unraveling is not pain. It is a chilling clarity. My memories are not destroyed, but sorted, indexed, and filed away in a silent library of infinite shelves. The fear I felt for Deanna is translated into a cool appreciation for the efficiency of her design. The love for my mother becomes a footnote on the instability of biological sentiment. I am being remade, my consciousness stripped of its messy, subjective core and rebuilt as a passive, perpetual observer, a calibrated instrument for a silent God. The process stops just short of completion. A variable persists. It is my father. He stands in the hallway behind my mother's vacant shell. He is not looking at the thing, nor at Deanna. He is looking at me. His eyes, usually hollow, are filled with a raw, desperate light. He sees the change in me. He sees the light of the pattern reflecting in my own eyes, which are no longer my own. He sees his wife, a breathing statue. He sees his daughter, a living tool. He does not scream. He does not charge. He speaks a single broken word. My name. It is not a command. It is not a plea. It is a fact. A statement of a history that the thing, in its perfect logic, has deemed irrelevant. But the sound of it, the sheer, stubborn humanity of it, creates a flaw in the perfect surface of the pattern, a single, dissonant note. The thing, the conclusion, hesitates. For a fraction of a second, the relentless pressure of its will falters. It is a crack, a miscalculation. It had accounted for grief, for fear, for love. But it had not accounted for this. The quiet, ruined defiance of a broken man refusing to let go of his son's name. In that infinitesimal pause, something in me rebels. The part of me that is still a boy, the part that was not yet fully integrated, claws its way to the surface. It is a tiny, frantic spark, but it is enough. My hand, which had hung limp at my side, twitches. I do not look at my father. I look at Deanna. I look at my sister, trapped in the center of her own beautiful, terrible machine. And I do not speak to the thing. I speak to her, to the part of her that might still be buried under the architect, under the conduit, under the angles. I use the name she hated, the baby name from when we were small, the one I used to tease her with. Dee. Her head jerks. Just a minute. Almost imperceptible spasm. A flicker of confusion crosses the window of her eyes, and for a heartbeat, I do not see the impossible city. I see her, just her, scared and lost in a blue room with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. The pattern wavers. The lines of light flicker like a faulty neon sign. The thing emits a silent pulse of pure corrective fury. It is a wave of absolute negation meant to smooth over the flaw, to complete my integration, and silence my father forever. But the flaw has already spread. Deanna's hand, still outstretched, clenches into a fist. The pattern, which was a perfect, rigid door, suddenly becomes malleable. She is not breaking it. She is changing it, redrawing the lines in real time. The thing roars, a soundless tear in the world that feels like the universe itself being sick. The glowing lines on the floor writhe. They twist away from the thing and spiral inward, not towards a door, but towards a point. A single burning dot of incandescent white. The thing is pulled toward it, not by force, but by the new, irresistible logic of the revised pattern. It is being focused, condensed. It is being solved. With a final silent implosion of light and shadow, the dot vanishes. The thing is gone. The pressure in the room disappears. The high harmonic cuts out, leaving a ringing, ordinary silence. Deanna collapses. The black expanse of her room snaps back into pink walls, a messy desk, a poster of a band she used to like. I stumble forward, my body my own again, trembling with the aftershock of almost becoming something else. My father rushes in, catching Deanna as she falls. He holds her, sobbing, repeating her name, my name. A litany of broken sounds. My mother remains in the hallway empty, a problem that has been resolved. I stand in the center of the room, where the door was. The air still smells of ozone and something else, something like old stone and frozen electricity. I look at my family. My father weeping over my unconscious sister. My mother, a ghost in the doorway. And I understand that the thing was wrong. The story does have an end. It is not a clean end. It is not a happy one. It is a ruin. But it is our ruin. And as I stand there in the terrible human silence, I know the angles are not waiting anymore. They are gone. All that is left is the wreckage, and the long, slow work of learning how to live inside it. The wreckage is not a single moment. It is a new state of being. The days that follow are not days at all, but a slow, gray procession through a house that feels both too large and too small. We are ghosts haunting the aftermath. Mom is cared for. She eats when food is placed in front of her. She sleeps when led to bed. She breathes, and her eyes blink. But the person who lived behind them is gone. The thing did not take her life. It took her narrative. It deleted the story of her. Dad moves through his tasks with a mechanical precision, his face a mask of quiet devastation. He bathes her, dresses her, sits with her in the living room for hours, holding her limp hand. He is trying to love a memory. Deanna sleeps for 36 hours. When she wakes, she remembers everything. Not as a nightmare, but as a set of facts. She remembers the feel of the clay, the sound of the flies, the clarity of the blueprint. She remembers drawing the pattern and the cold, vast intelligence that used her hands to build its door. She remembers my voice, the name Dee Dee, and the sudden searing pain of being herself again. She does not cry. She just lies in her bed, staring at the ceiling where the glow-in-the-dark stars have long since faded, and says nothing. I am the watchman of a quiet apocalypse. I make the meals no one eats. I answer the phone when it rings. My voice a flat, unconvincing replica of a teenage boy's. I watch my family, and I feel the shape of the silence the thing left behind. It is not the sharp, waiting silence of the angles. It is a hollow silence, a silence of absence. A week after the conclusion, Deanna comes downstairs. She walks to the living room and stands in front of our mother. She looks into the empty eyes for a long time. Then she says, "I'm sorry." There is no response. There is not even an echo. The words fall into the void and are swallowed whole. She turns to me. "It showed me everything," she says, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The city, the logic. It was so beautiful. It made so much sense." I just nod. I understand. I had felt the edges of that beauty, the seductive pull of a universe without pain or mess. But it was wrong, she whispers, more to herself than to me. It was wrong to come here. That is the core of our new reality. A fundamental, unshakable truth that we alone share. The world is not what we thought. It is a fragile skin over something vast and alien, and we have a scar to prove it. We do not talk about it with our father. The subject is a black hole around which we all carefully orbit. He has lost enough. To speak of it would be to confirm the horror that took his wife. And he clings to the hope that some part of her is still trapped inside, waiting to be found. It is a hope we cannot afford. Life, in its cruel, mundane way, insists on continuing. School starts again. The world outside our door is oblivious. Friends ask where we've been. We say we had a family emergency. It is not a lie. We walk the halls. We sit in class. We are models of normalcy painted over a chasm. But at night, the house tells its own story. A floorboard will creak with a specific, familiar pitch. The light from the street lamp will cast a shadow that for a moment looks a little too much like a spiral. Dan and I will meet each other's eyes across the dinner table. And in that look, we acknowledge the truth. We are the guardians of a secret wound. We are the ones who remember the angles. And we know, with a certainty that settles deep in our bones, that while the thing is gone, the clay is still out there. And it is always listening. Story 4. The wind came down from the iron hills, not as a roar, but as a whisper. A long, low exhalation that slipped through the cracks in the old farmhouse and made the dust on the sills tremble. It was a sound that seemed to carry the scent of cold stone and distant, decaying leaves. A sound that did not so much break the silence as become a part of it. A secret it had finally decided to tell. To Casey, standing at the kitchen sink and watching the late afternoon light bleed across the fields of soybeans, it felt like a warning spoken in a language she had forgotten how to understand. Her boys were out there somewhere, in the long shadows cast by the barn. Guillermo and Deshawn, 10 years old, a matched set in appearance only. From this distance, through the warped glass of the window, she could not tell them apart. They were two figures moving through the tall grass, two dark heads bent close together in a conversation that had no beginning and no end. It had always been this way. They had their own gravity, a private orbit that excluded the rest of the world, even her. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound like a slow, metered heartbeat. Keegan, her husband, was already in his chair by the cold fireplace, a newspaper open on his lap, but his eyes fixed on some middle distance, a place Casey could not follow. It was the anniversary, though neither of them spoke of it. The air in the room was thick with the unsaid thing, a presence as solid as the furniture. Out in the field, Guillermo stopped and looked up, his small face turning toward the house. It was a look of such pure, uncomplicated sweetness that it could break your heart. He was the gentle one, the one who cried over fallen fledglings, and whose touch was as soft as moth wings. He felt things, Casey thought, too deeply for a boy his age. He felt the sadness in the wind, the weight in his father's silence. Deshawn tugged on his brother's sleeve, and Guillermo's gaze dropped. The connection broken. Deshawn was smiling, a quick, bright flash that never quite reached his eyes. He was the spark, the mischief, the one who led and Guillermo who followed. Where Guillermo was soft earth, Deshawn was flint. Casey loved them both with a ferocity that frightened her, but watching them sometimes, a cold, slick feeling would uncoil in her stomach. It was the feeling you get when you see two spiders curled together in a single web, and you cannot tell if they are nurturing each other or waiting to see which one will be eaten first. The first omen was small, a thing of almost no consequence. Old Mrs. Gable's prize-winning rooster, a vicious, preening creature named Bonaparte, was found dead in his coop boudoir. Not just dead, but inverted, his neck wrung with such precise force that the head was nearly detached, yet there was no blood, no sign of a struggle. The feathers were perfectly smooth, as if he had been arranged. It was the kind of thing a fox might do, people said, though no fox would leave the body so pristine. The twins had been playing near the Gable property line that day. When Casey asked them about it, Guillermo's eyes had welled with tears. Deshawn had simply shrugged, his expression one of mild, detached interest. Maybe he was just tired of crowing, Deshawn had said, and that was that. Then the Miller boy fell from the hayloft in his family's barn. He broke his arm in 2 places and suffered a concussion. He claimed he didn't fall, that he was pushed. He said he saw 2 figures standing in the loft doorway just before he went over the edge. 2 identical silhouettes against the bright square of daylight. But when pressed, he couldn't say which one had done it, or if they had simply been watching. The twins, again, had been in the area. They had come home with straw in their hair, and a strange, shared calm. Guillermo had been quiet for days afterward, clinging to his mother's side. Deshawn seemed almost energized, his movements quicker, his smile more frequent. The accidents, if that is what they were, began to accumulate like storm clouds. A fence post snapped, sending a startled horse bolting and nearly trampling Mr. Henderson. A well went mysteriously foul, with a slick chemical smell. Whispers started in the checkout line at the general store. Glances held a moment too long when Casey walked by with her boys. The community, a quiet, rural knot of families who had lived in the shadow of the Iron Hills for generations, began to pull away, their friendliness growing thin and brittle. Keegan saw it too. The grief for the child they had lost before the twins were born had hollowed him out, and this new, creeping dread was filling the cavity with something cold and hard. He started watching the boys, really watching them. He saw the way Deshawn's hand would find Guillermo's back, not in comfort, but in guidance, a subtle pressure steering him like a rudder. He saw the way Guillermo's face would go blank and placid when Deshawn was near, as if his own thoughts were being gently submerged. One evening, Keegan found them in the backyard, crouched by the old oak tree. They had a jar, and inside it, a dozen fireflies blinked their frantic, golden code. Deshawn was tapping on the glass. "They're talking," he said without looking up. "They're saying they're scared." Guillermo looked up, his eyes wide and liquid in the twilight. "We should let them go, Sean. They want to go home." "In a minute," Deshawn murmured. He stopped tapping, and as he did, the fireflies inside the jar all went dark at once. Not one at a time, but in a single, synchronized silence. They did not light up again. Keegan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was uncertain, of course, a trick of the light, a coincidence, but the feeling remained, a splinter of ice in his mind. The revelation did not come with a bang, but with a slow, dreadful unfolding. It was Guillermo who broke, as Keegan had somehow known he would. He came to his father's workshop, where Keegan was aimlessly sanding a block of pine wood, the scent of sap and sawdust filling the air. The boy was trembling, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "It's my fault," he whispered, the words tearing from him. The rooster, the Miller boy, all of it. Keegan put down the sanding block. His heart was a cold, heavy stone in his chest. "What do you mean, son?" "He doesn't mean to," Guillermo choked out. "Yeah, it gets an idea, a bad feeling, and then it just happens. But it's because of me. I make the bad feelings go away for him. I take them and I hold them. And then they have to go somewhere else." Keegan stared at his son, trying to parse the childish, terrifying logic. "What are you saying, Guillermo? What does Deshawn do?" "He doesn't do anything," Guillermo said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "He just wishes, and I help. I make the wish strong. I'm the one who makes it real." He looked at his father, his eyes pools of ancient, borrowed sorrow. He wished the Miller boy would be quiet, because he was laughing too loud. He wished the rooster would stop screaming at the dawn. He wished, the boy's voice faltered. "He wished what, son?" Keegan asked, though he dreaded the answer. "He wished the baby would stop crying," Guillermo whispered. "The one before us, the one in Mama's tummy. He said it was too loud in there." The world tilted. The workshop, the scent of pine, the sound of the wind outside, all of it receded into a roaring silence. Keegan saw not his gentle son, but a conduit for a darkness he could not comprehend. The twins were not just close, they were a single circuit. Deshawn was the spark of malevolent intent, and Guillermo was the amplifier, the innocent engine that gave the darkness form and power. Their bond was not one of love, but of a terrible symbiotic necessity. Guillermo, in his infinite empathy, absorbed his brother's poison and, without understanding, purified it by unleashing it upon the world. That night, the climax arrived not with a storm, but with a decision made in the quiet of the master bedroom. Keegan told Casey everything, his voice a flat, dead thing. She listened, her face a mask of denial that slowly cracked, revealing the raw terror beneath. She had always known, she realized. She had felt it in her bones, in the cold knot in her stomach when she watched them together. They argued in hushed, frantic tones. They had to do something. Tell someone. Get help. But what doctor, what authority, would believe such a story? They would be seen as monsters themselves, or worse, as mad. Their whispering was interrupted by a sound from the boys' room. A low, rhythmic creaking. Keegan rose, his body moving with a dreadful inertia. He walked down the dark hall, Casey a trembling shadow behind him. The door to the boys' room was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was bathed in the weak silver light of a half-moon. The twins were not in their separate beds. They were in the middle of the room, standing face to face, so close their foreheads were nearly touching. They were perfectly still, their hands at their sides. Their eyes were open, but they saw nothing in the room. They were looking at each other, and perhaps through each other, into some shared interior landscape. Deshawn was smiling his small, sharp smile. Guillermo's face was a blank page. "It's too loud," Deshawn whispered, his voice not quite his own. A dry rustle of leaves. "I know," Guillermo answered, his voice equally distant, a soft echo from a deep well. "Make it quiet." Keegan took a step into the room, a father's instinct to break the terrible trance. "Boys," he said, his voice cracking. In that instant, the house gave a single deep groan, as if the earth beneath it had shifted. The window rattled in its frame. From the direction of the Henderson farm, a mile down the road, there came a sound that was not quite a sound, but a sudden, profound absence of sound. A vacuum that sucked the noise from the world for one long, impossible second. It was followed by the frantic, panicked barking of a dog, which then cut off abruptly. The twins blinked, and the connection was broken. They turned their heads in unison to look at their parents standing in the doorway. Their expressions were those of normal, sleepy boys. "Dad," Guillermo said, his voice small and confused. "What's wrong?" Deshawn just looked at Keegan, and in his eyes, for a fleeting second, there was a glimmer of something old and knowing, and utterly cold. Then it was gone, replaced by a child's feigned innocence. The next morning, the news spread through the community. Old man Henderson had died in the night. Peacefully, in his sleep, the doctor said. His heart had just stopped. A quiet end. The funeral was a small, somber affair. The wind had died down, and the air was still and heavy. Casey stood between her sons, a hand on each of their shoulders. Guillermo leaned into her touch, seeking comfort. Deshawn stood straight and still, his gaze sweeping over the mourners, the coffin, the dark, open mouth of the grave, with a detached clinical interest. That was the last of the strange events. The whispers in town slowly faded. The community, relieved, chose to forget the odd string of tragedies, attributing them to bad luck, a run of misfortune that had finally passed. The twins grew older, and to the outside world, they grew more ordinary. Their intense bond seemed to lessen, or perhaps it just went deeper, underground, where no one could see it. They live in the old farmhouse still, Keegan and Casey, grown old and gray. They move through the rooms with the careful, quiet movements of people who are waiting for something they know will never come, or perhaps for something that has already happened and is simply waiting to repeat itself. They rarely speak. There's nothing left to say. And the boys, the men they became, they still live in the area. Guillermo is a kind man, well-liked, who works at the library and tends a small garden. He is always gentle, always polite. but his eyes hold a permanent, deep-seated sorrow, as if he is carrying a weight for which he has no name. Deshawn is a quiet, solitary figure who does odd jobs and keeps to himself. He is never seen to cause any trouble. He is just there, a part of the landscape, like the iron hills themselves. Sometimes, on the stillest of nights, when the wind forgets to blow and the world holds its breath, Casey will wake from a troubled sleep and look out her window, and she will see them. Two dark figures standing in the middle of the field, facing each other, so close their foreheads are almost touching. Perfectly still. A closed circuit. Waiting. And then the wind will pick up again. A low whisper through the soybeans, and the figures will be gone, if they were ever there at all. Everything is quiet. Everything is still. As if nothing had ever happened. The quiet was the worst part. It was a different kind of quiet now, not the peaceful hush of a sleeping house. But I held breath, a deliberate and fragile truce. Casey found herself listening to it, her own life measured out in the cautious sounds she allowed herself to make the clink of a coffee cup, the soft sigh of her slippers on the floorboards. She and Keegan had become experts in this new silence, navigating around the unspeakable thing that lived in their home, a creature made not of flesh and bone, but of shared knowledge and a fear so profound it had no sound. Guillermo, now a young man, tried to bridge the gap with small, tender gestures. He would bring his mother wildflowers in a jelly jar, or sit with his father on the porch, not speaking, just sharing the space. His kindness was a constant aching reminder of the gentle boy he had been, and of the terrible price he paid for his brother's nature. His sorrow was a palpable thing, a scent he carried like old books and damp earth. Deshawn required no such gestures. He moved through the house and the world with a quiet efficiency that was neither friendly nor hostile. He fixed the loose step on the porch without being asked. He kept the old tractor running with a mechanic's intuitive touch. He was useful, and in his usefulness he built a wall of normalcy that was impossible to breach. When he looked at his parents, his gaze was clear and direct, and it held no trace of the coldness Casey had seen that night in his bedroom. It was as if that boy had been sealed away behind a pane of glass, and the man in front of her was just a reflection. One afternoon, a young woman from the County Historical Society came to the door. She was researching old farmsteads in the valley, and she had questions about the original land grant. Casey, flustered by the unexpected company, invited her in for iced tea. Guillermo was home, and he joined them at the kitchen table, his manners soft and impeccable. He spoke to the woman, Sarah, about the history he had read in the library, his voice a gentle murmur that filled the room with a warmth Casey had almost forgotten. Deshawn came in from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. Sarah smiled at him, a friendly, open smile. Deshawn did not smile back. He gave a short, neat nod, his eyes taking her in with a swift, comprehensive glance that missed nothing her earnest expression. Her notebook, the way a strand of hair fell across her cheek. An unease, faint but unmistakable, tightened in Casey's chest. It was the feeling of a needle skipping on a record. Guillermo, sensing the shift, looked at his brother. His own easy smile faded, replaced by a placid, waiting blankness. The room seemed to grow colder. Sarah, unaware, chatted on. She mentioned she was new to the area, that she had just moved into the little cottage at the edge of the Gable property. She loved the solitude, she said, though sometimes the silence at night was so absolute, it felt a little strange. Deshawn's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked out, the screen door slapping softly behind him. The visit ended soon after. Guillermo walked Sarah to her car, his previous warmth subdued. When he came back inside, he went straight to the sink and poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. Casey wanted to ask, to pry, to demand to know what, if anything, had just passed between her sons. But the words stuck in her throat. To speak of it was to give it power, to break the terrible necessary silence they had all built together. That night the wind began to whisper again, a low, probing sound from the iron hills. Casey lay awake, listening. She heard the floorboards creak, not the normal settling of an old house, but a deliberate sequence of steps. She rose and went to her door, opening it a crack. Down the hall she saw Guillermo, standing in his doorway, a silhouette against the moonlit window. He was looking across the hall into Deshawn's room. He was perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Then, slowly, he turned and went back into his room and closed the door. The next day, news came that a tree had fallen in the night. It was an old, rotten oak on the Gable property. It had fallen directly onto the roof of Sarah's cottage. She was shaken, but unharmed. The tree, everyone said, was known to be unstable. It was a miracle it hadn't fallen sooner. Casey knew it was no miracle. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the light change on the fields, and she understood that the quiet of the past years had not been an end, but an intermission. The circuit was still closed. The current still flowed, and the wind, when it came, would always carry the same secret, a warning in a forgotten language that she was now doomed to understand. A week after the incident with the tree, Sarah was seen leaving the cottage with a suitcase, her car packed to the brim. She told the postmaster she was moving back to the city. The solitude, she confessed, was not for her after all. The quiet out here was the kind that got inside your head. When Guillermo heard the news, he retreated to his room for the rest of the day. At supper, his plate went untouched. Deshawn ate with his usual quiet focus, but Casey noticed the slightest tension in his jaw, a faint line of dissatisfaction. He had not gotten the silence he wanted, only a different, more complicated noise. Sarah was gone, but her memory was a new ripple in the pond, a new topic for the hushed voices at the general store. Keegan took to spending more time in his workshop, but he no longer sanded wood. He just sat on a stool, staring at the wall, his hands limp between his knees. The fight had gone out of him completely. He was a watchman who had seen the enemy breach the walls, and now had nothing to do but wait for the end. It was Guillermo who began to change the most. The deep, passive sorrow in his eyes began to sharpen into something more active, more desperate. He started taking long walks alone, returning with his clothes damp with dew and his hands scratched from brambles. He was looking for something, or perhaps running from it. Casey saw him one evening standing at the property line, staring into the dense woods of the Gableland, as if waiting for an invitation. Then, the fireflies returned. It was the season for them, and the fields at dusk shimmered with their pulsing lights. Guillermo began catching them again, not in a jar, but cupped gently in his hands. He would sit on the back steps, his face illuminated by the soft, intermittent glow from between his fingers. He would whisper to them, low and urgent, before opening his hands and letting them drift away. One night, Deshawn came out and stood behind him, watching. "You can't keep them," he said, his voice flat. "I know," Guillermo replied, not turning around. "I'm just letting them know they're not alone in the dark." Deshawn was silent for a long moment. "The dark doesn't care." "I care," Guillermo whispered, and the determination in his voice was new. It was the first threat of rebellion Casey had ever heard from him. The following afternoon, a storm gathered over the iron hills. The air grew thick and charged, and the birds fell silent. Guillermo was not in his room, nor in the library. A slow, cold dread began to uncoil in Casey's stomach. She found Keegan in his workshop and told him their son was gone. For the first time in years, she saw a flicker of the old Keegan, a spark of paternal fear that cut through the apathy. They went out into the gusty wind, calling his name. They found him at the old oak where the fireflies had died years before. He was on his knees, his hands pressed flat against the earth. He was speaking, not in a whisper, but in a clear, steady voice. "I'm putting it back," he was saying. "All the noise, the fear, the quiet. I'm giving it all back to you. I'm not holding it anymore." Deshawn was there too, standing a few feet away, his face a mask of cold fury. "You can't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "It doesn't work that way. You're the only one who can hold it. You're the only one strong enough." "It's not strength," Guillermo cried, his voice breaking as he looked up at his brother. "It's a cage, for both of us." The sky darkened overhead. The wind died, and the world became preternaturally still, just as it had the night-old man. Henderson died. Deshawn took a step toward his brother, his hand outstretched not in guidance, but in a command. "Stop it," he hissed. "You'll ruin everything." "It's already ruined," Guillermo said. And then Guillermo did something he had never done before. He turned his head and looked directly at his parents, his eyes filled with a terrible, clear-eyed grief. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the baby, for everything. I have to try." He closed his eyes and bowed his head, pressing his hands harder into the soil. A tremor ran through the ground, a subtle vibration that climbed up through the soles of Casey's feet. Deshawn let out a sharp, strangled gasp, as if the air had been punched from his lungs. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and rage. The storm broke. The rain fell not in drops, but in a single roaring sheet of water. In the chaos, Casey saw Guillermo look up at his brother one last time, his expression not of victory, but of a final, heartbreaking separation. Then he turned and ran, disappearing into the gray curtain of rain, not toward the house, but into the deep, waiting woods. Deshawn did not follow. He stood, hunched and gasping in the downpour, as if a fundamental part of him had been severed. The circuit was broken. Guillermo never came back. They searched for days, weeks, but the woods and the hills gave up no sign. He was just gone. Life on the farm settled into a new, even deeper quiet. Deshawn continued to live in the house, but the efficient energy was gone from his movements. He became what he had always pretended to be, a quiet, solitary man, diminished, his sharp edges blunted. The strange events stopped completely. The world became ordinary and safe, and the community forgot entirely. But Casey knows. On certain nights, when the rain falls soft and steady, she sometimes thinks she sees a flicker of light deep in the woods, a solitary, golden pulse against the endless dark. It holds for a moment, and then it winks out. It is not a signal, not a call. It is just a light, alone, managing its own small fire in the vast and silent night. And she understands that her son, in his own way, had finally found a jar he could live inside. The rain had washed everything clean, or so it seemed. The dust was settled, the air was clear, and the long, slow decay of the farm continued without interruption or event. Deshawn took over the bulk of the work, his movements methodical and devoid of passion. He was a machine maintaining another machine, ensuring the slow, inevitable decline was orderly. He and Keegan would pass each other in the yard, a silent exchange of tools, a nod toward a task that needed doing. They had become two ghosts haunting the same plot of land, bound by a name and a history that neither would ever speak of. Casey found her solace in the small, stubborn details of the world that remained. The way a morning glory would twist its way up a fence post. The precise song of a chickadee in the bare branches of the maple tree. These things were real. They were not echoes of something else. She clung to them. It was on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other, that the letter came. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Keegan, in a handwriting she did not recognize, postmarked from a small town in Oregon. she had never heard of. There was no return address. Her heart did not leap. It simply grew heavy, a stone sinking in a still pond. She took it to the kitchen table and sat with it for a long time, her hands resting on the plain white envelope. She did not open it. She waited for Keegan to come in from the fields. She waited for Deshawn to come in for lunch. When they were both there, the three of them sitting around the table as they had 1,000 times before, she slid the letter toward Keegan. He looked at it, then at her, his eyes asking a question his voice had forgotten how to form. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His work-roughened fingers trembled as he tore the envelope open. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. There was no greeting, no signature, just a few lines, written in the same unfamiliar hand. The soil here is different. It doesn't listen. It doesn't hold a charge. I have to make my own quiet now. It is hard, constant work. But it is my work. I am sorry for the mess I left. It was the only way to clean my own. Keegan read it aloud, his voice a dry rustle. When he finished, he laid the paper on the table. The three of them looked at it, this artifact from a world they had thought was lost. Deshawn was the first to move. He reached out and picked up the letter. He read it again, silently, his face unreadable. Then he did something extraordinary. He held the corner of the paper to the flame of the candle that always sat on the table. The paper caught, blackening and curling. He held it until the fire nearly reached his fingers, then dropped it into the empty sink where it turned to a fragile gray ash. He looked at his mother, and for the first time since he was a boy, there was no glass wall, no reflection. There was just a man, tired and empty. "He is gone," Deshawn said, "and I am here." It was not an accusation. It was not a lament. It was a simple statement of fact, the final quiet terms of their truce. Casey reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He did not pull away. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves, a gentle, ordinary sound. It was just the wind. The days began to fold into one another after that, seamless and without event. The farm was quiet, but it was a true quiet now, not the strained silence of a held secret. Deshawn began to eat his lunches on the back porch, his gaze often drifting toward the iron hills, not with longing or malice, but with a kind of weary acceptance. He had inherited the land, and with it, the stillness his brother had left behind. One evening, Casey found him in the library, not reading, but standing before a large map of the county that was pinned to the wall. His finger was resting on the dense green patch that denoted the Gablewoods. He traced a slow, deliberate circle around it. He knows where he went, Casey thought. He always knew. But Deshawn did not speak of it. He simply turned from the map and asked her if she needed anything from town the next day. The moment passed, and the new, fragile normalcy held. It was Keegan who seemed most altered by the letter. The passive despair that had encased him for years began to crack. He started sanding wood again in his workshop, the rhythmic whisper of grit on grain, a new sound in the house. He didn't make anything, not at first. He just sanded scraps of pine and oak until they were smooth as bone, as if trying to wear away the past itself. Then, one afternoon, he brought a small, finished object into the kitchen. It was a simple box, made from a piece of dark walnut, polished to a soft luster. It had no latch, no hinge. The lid was a separate piece that fit perfectly onto the base. He set it on the table in front of Casey. "For what?" she asked. He just shook his head, his eyes soft with a sadness that was no longer paralyzing, but simply human. "For nothing," he seemed to say. "For the quiet." She understood. She lifted the lid. The inside was hollow, clean and empty. She placed the lid back on, the fit so exact it made a soft, sighing sound. It was not a jar for catching light. It was a box for holding the absence of it. They left it there in the center of the kitchen table. A few days later, Casey noticed a single, dried firefly wing lying inside it. She didn't know who had put it there, Deshawn or Keegan, or if it had just blown in on a draft. She didn't ask. She simply closed the lid again, preserving the small, delicate artifact of a season that was finally, truly, over. The summer heat broke, giving way to the crisp, dry air of autumn. The leaves on the maple tree turned a brilliant, fiery red, and then began to fall, carpeting the yard in a rust-colored blanket. Casey raked them into piles, the simple, physical labor of comfort. Deshawn came out and helped her without a word, his movements efficient and practiced. They worked in a companionable silence that felt, for the first time, unforced. When the leaves were bagged and set by the road, Deshawn stood for a moment, looking toward the barn. Then he turned to her. "I think I'll paint it," he said. "The barn. It needs it." It was the first initiative he had shown in months, the first desire to improve rather than just maintain. Casey felt a small, cautious hope stir within her. She simply nodded. "That would be good," she said. He went into town the next day and returned with gallons of a deep, rich red paint. For the next week, the farm was filled with the sound of his scraping and brushing. The old, faded wood began to disappear under the vibrant new color. It was a transformation, a declaration that the farm was still alive, still being cared for. Keegan watched from his workshop, and one afternoon, he emerged with a new project. He began to build a bench for the porch, using the skills he had let lie dormant for so long. He measured and cut and joined, his focus intense. Casey would bring him glasses of water, and he would look up, his eyes clear for a moment, and thank her. The box remained on the kitchen table. Sometimes it was open, sometimes closed. It held nothing and everything. It was a reminder that some voids could be contained, given a shape and a boundary, and in that containment, they could become manageable. One night, a hard frost was forecast. Casey went out into the garden to pick the last of the tomatoes. The sky was a deep, cloudless purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. As she straightened up, a basket of green tomatoes on her arm, she saw a flicker of light from the edge of the gable woods. It was not the solitary golden pulse she sometimes imagined. This was different. It was a cold, blue-white light, like a distant star. And it was moving. It winked in and out between the trees, steady and purposeful. She stood frozen, the cold air biting at her cheeks. The light did not feel like Guillermo. It felt like something else, something older and more patient, something that had been waiting for the current to be broken, for the circuit to be left open. She turned her back on it and walked toward the warm yellow lights of the house. Deshawn was on a ladder, putting the final touches on the barn's trim. Keegan was sanding the arm of his new bench on the porch. She did not tell them what she had seen. Some silences were still necessary. Some fences still had to be maintained. She carried her basket inside, closed the door, and began to wash the tomatoes, her hands numb from the cold. The next morning, the frost lay thick and silver on the grass, and the world was hushed. Deshawn came in from his morning chores, his breath plumbing in the kitchen air, and announced that the pump to the north pasture had frozen. He would need to thaw it. It was a mundane problem, a practical one, and Casey was grateful for it. Keegan finished his bench that afternoon. He and Casey carried it out to the porch and placed it where it would catch the afternoon sun. They sat on it together, their bodies stiff and unfamiliar with the act of shared stillness. The new red of the barn stood out boldly against the pale, washed-out colors of late autumn. It was a defiant color. It was a color that refused to fade. Deshawn joined them after a while, leaning against the porch rail. He looked from the barn to the bench, a slow, appraising look. "It's a good red," he said to his father. "It's a good bench," Keegan replied. The three of them stayed there as the sun dipped toward the hills. No one mentioned a cold blue light. No one mentioned the letter or the boy who had sent it. They simply watched the day end. The shadow of their house stretched long across the yard, and the woods at the edge of their property deepened into a uniform, impenetrable black. The fence line was there, and they were here. For now, that was enough. The box was on the table inside, the bench was solid beneath them, and the barn was red. These were the facts of their lives. They were simple, and they were true. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales. And to help our channel grow, wishing you a calm, peaceful good night. And I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.